The rain came sideways off the Clyde that April night, and Blythswood Square lay under a low, grey hush. In the basement window of number 7, a girl of 22 knelt at the iron grate with a cup between her hands. The cocoa steamed. The gas lamp above her shivered in its glass. Beyond the bars, in the sunken area where the servants brought in the coal, a young man in a damp overcoat took the cup from her fingers. His name was Pierre-Émile Langelier. He had walked from Franklin Place in the wet, and he was cold to the bone. He drank. He smiled at her through the grate. He went home along Great Western Road, and by dawn he was on his knees in a lodging-house doorway, holding his stomach and calling for a doctor who would not come in time. The quiet before the fall. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world outside your window has gone quiet in the way that only late hours can bring. Wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever city or town, on whatever side of the ocean, I hope the hour finds you warm and held. If you are lying in the dark with the lamp already turned low, if you are curled beneath a blanket after a long day, if you are somewhere the trains have stopped running, then you are in the right place. Tell me, if you would, where you are and what hour has crept up on you. I like to imagine the map of us as the story begins, the small lights of listeners scattered across the world in the dark. And if this voice becomes a companion to you on this night or on others, then please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to press the small mark of approval that helps the video travel further. It costs nothing, and it lets stories like this one find the next listener who needs them. Tonight we will go back 169 years, to a city of soot and grey stone and river fog, to a house on a high square in the West End of Glasgow, and to a girl who was still a girl in the eyes of her family, and already something else in the eyes of a young man who came to her by night. Come with me. The lamps of our own century are behind us. The gaslight is ahead. Glasgow, in the winter of 1856, was a city grown fat on smoke. Its wealth came in ships and left in ships, and everything between the docks and the moors bore the mark of that traffic. The Clyde carried tobacco, cotton, sugar, iron, and the memory of an older trade that no one in the drawing rooms spoke of directly any longer. The river was a working thing, brown and busy, and it never quite gave up its low, wet smell, even in the streets that pretended not to hear it. Above the river, on the raised ground to the north of the old town, a new Glasgow had risen in the previous 30 years, a Glasgow of terraces and squares and pale ashlar stone, of iron railings and long sash windows and doors painted the colour of dried blood or the colour of a duck's egg. It was a city built by men who wanted to be believed. Their houses were the argument. Number 7, Blythswood Square, sat among those houses like a page in a bound book. The square itself had been laid out in the 1820s on the sloping ground above Sauchiehall Street, and by our winter it had settled into itself. Its central garden was fenced by black iron, and only those who lived on the 4 sides held a key. The trees inside the railings were bare that season, thin and orderly, and the paths between them were kept tidy by a gardener no one ever really saw. On the pavements outside, the flagstones were dark with wet, and the horse traffic left its ordinary marks. The lamplighter came at dusk with his long pole, and lit the gas globes one by one, and the light they gave was not white and not yellow, but something between the two, a soft, uncertain colour that flattered the stone and softened the rain. Inside number 7, the house followed the pattern of its street. The front door opened onto a hall of polished tiles, black and white in a plain diamond, and beyond the hall a curved staircase rose to the drawing-room floor. The drawing-room itself looked out over the square from 3 tall windows, and its curtains were of a heavy red damask that had been chosen by Mrs. Smith when the family took the lease. The furniture was walnut, buttoned in horsehair, and the pianoforte in the corner had been shipped up from a maker in London. On the mantelpiece stood a French clock under a glass dome, and beside the clock a pair of Staffordshire spaniels, that no one in the family especially loved, but that no one had thought to move. A fire burned in the grate from breakfast until bedtime through the winter months, kept up by a housemaid whose name was Christina Haggart, and who came from the country and slept in a small room off the kitchen. The master of the house was James Smith, architect, a man in his early 50s who had made his reputation on churches and warehouses and on the practical business of building the new Glasgow that was rising around him. He was a Presbyterian of the older kind, who believed in prayer and in punctuality and in the education of daughters within reason. He kept his office in the town and walked to it most mornings, and he came home for his dinner at 5 and read the paper by the fire until 9. He was not a cruel man. He was not an especially warm one either. He believed that a well-ordered household was a form of piety, and he ran his own household on that principle, and the principle held. His wife, Janet, kept the accounts of the house in a small leather book that she carried in the pocket of her apron. She had been a beauty in her time. In our winter she was a mother of 5, tired more often than she liked to admit, and possessed of a quiet migraine that came on in the afternoons and sent her to lie down in the small back parlour with a damp cloth across her forehead. The doctor called it a nervous complaint. She called it her head and left it at that. She was fond of her children, and she was proud of them, and she trusted them more than perhaps she ought to have done, because trust was cheaper than watching. The eldest of those children was Madeleine. She had been baptised Madeleine Hamilton Smith in the year 1835, in a parish outside the city, and she had come of age between the schoolroom of a boarding house in the south of England and the drawing rooms of Glasgow. She was, that winter, 21 years old. She was slight, with dark hair parted in the centre and drawn back into a smooth twist at the nape of her neck, and her eyes were a light hazel that changed colour with the weather. She dressed as her mother liked, in the modest afternoon fashion of the day, in a bodice fitted close to the waist and a wide skirt supported by whalebone and horsehair, and she wore a small cameo brooch at her throat that had been a gift on her 17th birthday. She played the piano competently, and she sang in a small, clear voice, and she read novels when her mother was not in the room, and Blackwood's magazine when her mother was. She had been taught French by a governess, and she could hold a conversation in it, if the subject was tea or weather or the Queen. She was, to any visitor at the front door, exactly the daughter such a house would produce. Below her in age came Bessie, then Janet the younger, then John, and then a smaller child in the nursery whose birthday still fell in April each year. The Smith siblings shared a schoolroom on the upper floor and a governess who came in by the day, and they shared, in the way of siblings in a strict house, the small, unspoken understandings that let a family live together without constant war. Bessie was closer to Madeleine than the others, and slept in the same bedroom on the upper floor, in a bed on the far side of a folding screen. Bessie was the confidant by proximity, not by choice, and there were nights when she would learn things she had not asked to learn, and would carry them, uneasy, into her own sleep. The household had its rhythm, and the rhythm was firm. The maid Christina rose before 6 to lay the fires. The cook came down soon after, and set the kitchen going. Breakfast was at 8 in the small dining room off the hall, porridge and tea and toast and, on the days when Mr. Smith felt indulgent, a herring or a boiled egg. After breakfast, the master went out to his office. The children went to the schoolroom. Mrs. Smith took the account book into the back parlour and did battle with the butcher and the coal merchant on paper. Dinner was served at 5, and the family ate together at the long table with the silver that had been Mrs. Smith's mother's, and grace was said by the head of the house in a voice that did not invite comment. After dinner, the drawing-room fire was built up, and the pianoforte was opened, and one of the daughters was asked to play. Prayers were read at 9:30. The gas was turned down at 10. By 11, the house was, to any observer, asleep. That was the arrangement. That was the surface. What lay beneath the surface is the reason we are here at all. For Madeleine, the days at Blythswood Square were long and thin. She had done with her schooling. She had come out into Glasgow society in the small, careful way permitted to a daughter of her station, which meant that she had been taken to concerts at the City Hall and to sermons in the West Church, and that she had stood in her mother's drawing room while callers were received, and that she had been introduced at 2 or 3 private dances given by families her father approved of. She was, in the language of the day, of an age to be settled. Her father had views on how settling ought to be done. He wanted a merchant, and he wanted a Scot, and he wanted a man of substance who would not need to be lifted into the house from below. He was in no great hurry, because he trusted the process, and because he trusted his daughter, and because it did not occur to him that a girl in a bonnet who played Chopin passably could be anywhere in her heart that he had not already mapped for her. Madeleine, in the meantime, filled the empty hours as girls of her station filled them. She practiced at the piano in the morning while the light was cold and pale in the drawing-room. She walked out with her sister in the afternoon, along the pavements of Sauchiehall Street, past the milliner and the bookseller and the confectioner and the tea-room where 2 Miss Somethings kept a table for ladies. She went with her mother on Sundays to church and sat in the family pew and listened to a sermon that lasted an hour and a quarter and was, in her own private judgment, a little longer than the good Lord had asked for. She wrote letters to a school friend in Edinburgh and to a cousin who had married a linen merchant in Manchester. She read novels she was not supposed to read, and she read them behind the door of her bedroom by the light of a single candle, and she put them back on the shelf face inward the moment she heard a foot on the stair. There was, in the tall grey house, a sort of listening that never stopped. The maid moved through the rooms with her ear tuned to bells. The mother moved through the rooms with her ear tuned to daughters. The father, when he was in, moved through the rooms with his ear tuned to whatever might disturb his evening. And Madeleine, moving between them, learned early the small useful art of the closed door and the lowered voice. She was not a rebellious girl in any showy sense. She did not slam a door. She did not raise a cry. What she had, instead, was a talent for quiet, and quiet, in a house like that one, was a form of freedom. Below the polished floor she walked on, below the tiles of the hall, and below the boards of the drawing-room, the house dropped away into another world. The sunken area at the front of the building was reached by a narrow flight of steps down from the pavement, cut through the ashlar and railed in iron. This was the servants' door, and the coal chute, and the low window of the kitchen and of the small room where the girl of the house, oddly, kept her bed. In the arrangement of the Smith household, Madeleine's bedroom had been placed on the basement level, at the front, with a window that looked out into the area and up through the iron railings to the pavement above. It was not a punishment. It was, in a household of many children and few spare rooms, simply where she had ended up. The room was a fair size. It held a mahogany bedstead and a marble washstand and a writing desk under the window, and its wallpaper was a pattern of small dark flowers on a lighter ground. She had a mirror above the washstand and a china candlestick beside the bed, and she had her books on a low shelf, and she had, in the drawer of the desk, a bundle of letters tied with a piece of ribbon. The bundle was not large yet. It would grow. Beyond her window, the area was a stone pit in the wall of the city. In the daytime it was full of the traffic of the household, of the coalman with his Hessian sack, of the baker's boy with his basket, of the fishmonger's man with his slab and his knife. At night it was empty. The gas of the square glowed above the railings, and the lamp on the pavement threw its light down into the sunken space, and the shadows in the corners were deep. From the street above, if you were walking home late along Blythswood Square, you would not think of the area at all. You would see only the fine tall house and the drawn curtains and the lit fanlight above the door. You would not think of the pit under the pavement, or of the low window at the back of it, or of the girl who slept behind that window with her books on the shelf and her letters in the desk. There was no reason to think of her. She was one more well-brought-up daughter in one more well-run house, and Glasgow was full of them. That is the picture I want to leave with you tonight, before we go any further. The tall grey house on the square, the red curtains at the drawing-room windows, the clock ticking under its dome on the mantelpiece, the maid asleep at last in her small room off the kitchen, the father in his bed above, his newspaper folded on the chair, the mother in hers, her nervous headache easing at last into sleep, the younger children breathing evenly on the upper floor. And, at the front of the house, one story below the pavement, a young woman not yet asleep, sitting up in her nightdress at the writing desk under the low window, with a candle at her elbow and a sheet of paper in front of her, and the pen in her hand still, for the moment, waiting. Outside, the rain has stopped. The gas lamps of Blythswood Square burn on through the small hours, and the iron railings glisten, and the flagstones dry slowly in the wind that comes up off the river. Somewhere out in the darkening city, in a lodging in another street, a young man from the Channel Islands has just come in from his evening walk and is setting his damp coat on the back of a chair to dry. He does not yet know the name of the girl at the desk on Blythswood Square. She does not yet know his. In a matter of months, a friend on the pavement of Sauchiehall Street will draw them together, and everything that follows in this story will begin from that meeting. The house will keep its rhythm. The father will keep his hours. The clock under the glass dome will keep its time. And the quiet, careful surface of number 7 will hold, for a little longer, over what is already stirring below. A daughter of Blythswood Square. Let us step back from the desk under the window, and from the pen still waiting in her hand, and follow the girl backward instead of forward for a little while. Before there was a young woman in a nightdress at Blythswood Square, there was a child in a nursery in another part of Glasgow, and before there was a child in that nursery, there was, on a March morning in 1835, a wet cry in a rented bedroom above a Glasgow street, and a young father downstairs turning the pages of an unread book. Madeleine Hamilton Smith came into the world with all the propriety of her class, and none of her own choosing. Her mother was 23. Her father was 6 years older. The nurse who lifted her out of the sheets that morning had been at 3 other Glasgow births that week, and would be at 2 more before the Sabbath. Nothing about her arrival was written down beyond the entry in the parish book, and a line to a grandmother in tinted notepaper. The record is thin, in the way that the records of daughters usually are. Their first years together, mother and firstborn, passed in a set of lodgings that James Smith kept off Great Western Road. He was not yet the architect whose name would appear in the post office directories under his own plate. He was still a young man in a drawing office, learning the trade of stone and slate and setting out, walking home in the evenings with chalk still under his fingernails. The rooms he rented were 3 flights up, and the window of the front parlour looked over a chimney pot and, on the clearest days, a strip of the River Kelvin. There was a horsehair sofa in that parlour, and a turkey rug that had been a wedding gift, and there was a boxed piano squeezed against the party wall that Janet Smith played in the afternoons to settle the child. She played hymns mostly, and 1 or 2 Scots airs, and, once in a great while, a waltz she had learned as a girl and had never quite been able to leave behind. Madeleine was 2 when her sister Bessie arrived, and 4 when Janet the younger came, and by the year she was 6, the parlour above the chimneys had grown too tight for the household James Smith was becoming. He was building a practice by then. He was drawing schools and warehouses, and 1 or 2 of the merchant villas that were creeping westward out of the old grid, and he had begun to keep a clerk. The family moved twice within a few streets, each move a little further west and a little higher up the ladder, and each move made in a single day with a hired van and 2 carters and a temper on the stairs. I want you to picture that childhood plainly, because it matters for what comes later. The Smith children did not grow up in the tall house on the square. That house belonged to their father's later, richer years. The years I am speaking of now were more ordinary. They ate at a scrubbed pine table in a plain back room, and their father brought his work home in a leather roll and unrolled it on that table after tea, and their mother went round with a duster before she would let them near the drawings. The girls wore pinafores over their frocks in the daytime, and were changed into cleaner ones for the drawing-room in the evening. They shared beds and combs, and the same governess for a season or two, a Miss McCraw from Paisley who taught them their letters and their needlework and their catechism in that order. The house smelled of coal smoke and boiled milk and the vinegar their mother used on the windows, and it was the smell of most Glasgow childhoods of that decade, in that class, and the girls would have known no other. There were rules early. James Smith believed in rules the way other men believed in luck. Speak when spoken to at the table. Fold your napkin. To say grace in an audible voice. Never leave the house without gloves. Never sit down at the piano with unclean hands. Never open a book at dinner. Never argue with the maid. Never repeat a servant's word in the drawing room. Sundays were for church twice, and for the reading of a printed sermon in the evening, and no visiting was done, and no needlework beyond the mending of stockings, and the girls sat in the family pew with their hair drawn back, and their bonnets in their laps, and did not fidget, or, if they fidgeted, did so under a shawl. The plan for Madeleine's education was fixed by the time she was 10. She would go south. Glasgow, for her father, was a good enough city for a man to earn in, but it was not, in his private view, quite the right city for a girl to finish in. He wanted her polished. He wanted a little English in her voice, if it could be had, and a little French in her writing hand, and the manners of a household that was not his own. He made inquiries through a merchant cousin in Manchester, and by that route he found Mrs. Gorton, who kept a boarding school for young ladies at Clapton, in the northeastern outskirts of London, and who was known for accepting girls from good Scottish families for a term of years. Come with me for a moment away from the tall square and out of Glasgow altogether, because to understand Madeleine at 21, you have to sit for a moment with Madeleine at 12. She travelled south in the summer of 1847 with her father in a first-class carriage and a trunk of new dresses her mother had spent a fortnight making up. The railway had reached the whole way by then, and the journey took the better part of 2 days with a change and an inn along the road. She wept into her handkerchief for the first hour, and then, being the sort of child she was, dried her face and looked out of the window and did not weep again. Her father read the paper at her side and did not look up. He was not unkind about the tears. He simply thought they were something to be finished with. Clapton, in that year, was half village and half suburb, set on the low ground east of Hackney Marsh. The school stood in its own grounds on a lane not far from the marsh path, in a plain brick house of 3 stories, with a walled garden behind and a laurel hedge along the front. Mrs. Gorton was a widow of about 60, with white curls pinned tight to her temples, and a pearl brooch at her collar that she was said to have worn every day for 30 years. She took perhaps 20 girls at a time, and she took them on the understanding that they were her daughters for the term, and that their fathers would not intrude except on prize day, and, if absolutely necessary, at Christmas. The days at Clapton ran on a bell. The girls rose at 7 and prayed at past. They breakfasted on bread and butter and weak tea, and they went into the schoolroom at 9. They did French with a Frenchman who came in on a horse omnibus and left before dinner, and they did Italian with the same man on Thursdays, and they did geography and use of the globes from a mistress called Miss Wickham, who had been with Mrs. Gorton for 18 years and would be with her until the day of her death. They read Shakespeare aloud in the afternoons, standing up in turn, and they wrote themes on subjects like duty and prudence and the character of Portia. They walked out in pairs along the marsh path on Wednesday afternoons if the weather held, and if it did not, they walked round the garden in 2s and 3s with their arms linked and their heads bent close. They dined at 4. They practised at the piano until 6. They sewed by lamplight until 8. They said their prayers again at 9 and were in bed by 10, with the candles snuffed and the door of the dormitory locked from the outside for the night. That was the schooling. That was, in a way, the making of Madeleine Hamilton Smith. She spent 4 winters and 3 summers at Mrs. Gorton's, and she came back at Christmases and at midsummer to a household in Glasgow that was every year a little larger and a little richer than the one she had left. Bessie grew up in her absence. A brother, John, was born while she was in her second year, and another child arrived while she was in her fourth, and by the time she came home, her mother's headaches had settled into a fixed evening pattern that would never quite leave her. We do not really know, and I want to say this plainly, what those Clapton years did to her inside. Girls of her sort did not keep diaries that survived, and her letters home have not come down, and the school records themselves have not survived, and Mrs. Gorton went into the earth long ago with all her memory intact and none of it written. What we do know is that Madeleine came back to Glasgow in the summer of 1853, at 18 years of age, with a straight back and an English inflection on certain of her vowels and a marked taste for novels, and that within a year she had learned to keep the novels and the thoughts to herself in the manner her father expected, and that she had begun to write, in the copperplate hand Miss Wickham had taught her, letters of a kind no one at Mrs. Gorton's would have signed. She came back into a new house. Or, rather, she came back into an old house that was about to be exchanged for a newer one. James Smith had done well enough by the early 50s to bring his family up onto Blythswood Hill, into a rented house on India Street first, and then, by the winter of 1855, into the tall grey house at number 7 of the square. He had drawn the alterations himself, and he had chosen the paper for the drawing room, and he had had his own initials cut into the stone above the coach entry, and he had walked his family up the flight from the pavement on their first morning with the pride of a man who has arrived exactly where he had told himself, at 19, that he would arrive. Madeleine walked up those steps with him, in a new bonnet and a new pair of French kid gloves, and if she had thoughts about the arrangement of the bedrooms, and about the fact that she was to be placed at the front on the basement level, with a window into the area, she did not share them. There was another house too. I should mention it now, because it will matter before we are done. On the north bank of the Clyde estuary, at the little parish of Roe, near Helensburgh, her father built himself a summer villa in these years and called it Roeline. It was a plain, pleasant house of the sort a prospering Glasgow man built for a wife who wanted sea air and for children who wanted a garden. It had a lawn that ran down toward the water and a shrubbery on the landward side and a room they called the garden parlour, with French doors that were opened at breakfast and closed at bedtime. In the summers the whole family went down by steamer from the Broomielaw and did not come up again until the equinox, and it was there, and not in Glasgow, that Madeleine spent the longest continuous stretches of her early adulthood, long, unpoliced, unhurried weeks in a shaded room, with a book and a writing case, and the sound of the Clyde starting and stopping on the shingle at the foot of the lawn. Her father's hopes for her in these years were plain and calm, and not, in themselves, cruel. He wanted her to marry well. He wanted her to marry a Glasgow man, a Scot, a Presbyterian, a man of trade or of the professions with a name he had already heard in the counting houses. He wanted her married by 23 and settled in her own house by 25, and he wanted a christening in his church within the year that followed. He would provide the necessary sum for a wedding and a modest sum toward the furnishing, and he would expect, in return, that she would live within a comfortable walk of Blythswood Square and would come to her mother on Sundays. He said none of this to her in so many words. He did not need to. The whole household spoke it around her every day in 100 wordless ways, and she had known it since Clapton, and she did not, at first, resist it. What she did instead, in that first year back and in the second and in the third, was become restless in the way that daughters in strict houses have always become restless, without ever quite giving themselves away. She walked out with Bessie in the afternoons. She went to the concerts and the sermons her father approved of. She took her turn at the pianoforte after dinner, and she said her prayers at 9:30, and she went down to her basement room at 10. She read the novels behind the door. She wrote her letters to Edinburgh and to Manchester. She looked, sometimes, in the mirror above the washstand for longer than the light really justified. She was waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something the household could not provide. That something, in the shape of a young man from the Channel Islands with a foreign name and a warehouse coat and a hopeful, wounded manner, was already at that moment lodging in a boarding house in another quarter of the city, walking to his work each morning past the shops of Sauchiehall Street and back each evening through the wet lamplight, entirely unknown to her, and only a few streets removed from the door through which he would, before very long, be brought. The clerk from Jersey. I'll write Chapter 3 now, following the master prompt's voice and continuity rules. Before we open the door of a lodging house in Franklin Place and meet the young man who will die in it, we have to travel further than Glasgow will let us go on foot. We have to go south, down the length of England, across the Channel, to a small green island in a bay off the coast of France, and to a garden behind a modest house in the town of St. Helier. The story that ends in an area window on Blythswood Square begins there, in soil that smells of salt and of the sea wind that never really stops. Come with me. It is only a page in an atlas. The distance is nothing to us. The island of Jersey, in the 1820s, was a place caught between two languages and two loyalties. Its people were subjects of the British Crown, and had been for the better part of 600 years. But they spoke a Norman French in the market and in the kitchen, and they wrote their letters in a French that carried the older forms. St. Helier, the chief town, faced south toward the coast of Normandy, across a stretch of water no wider than a summer's afternoon at sea. Its harbour filled at every tide with fishing smacks and coasters, and the packet from Southampton. Its streets climbed up from the quays in a fan of narrow lanes, and its houses were of the local granite, low and thick-walled, and built to hold against the winter gales that came in from the west. Into one of those houses, on a spring morning in 1823, a boy was born and named Pierre-Émile Langelier. His father was a nurseryman, a grower of seedlings and cuttings, and the ornamental shrubs the English visitors were beginning to want in their gardens on the hill above the town. His mother was of the same stock, a woman of the island, who had never set foot on the mainland of France, and never expected to. They kept a plot of ground on the outskirts of St. Helier, with glass houses of a sort and a shed for the potting, and they raised their children between the seed trays and the counting of coins on a Saturday night. Émile was the third of those children, and the first of the sons who lived past infancy. The record of his baptism survives in the parish book at St. Helier. Almost nothing else of that childhood does. You have to imagine the boy for yourself, then, out of what people who knew him later would say. He was slight from the beginning, and would stay slight. He had dark hair and dark eyes and the fine, thin bones of his mother's people. He was easily flushed and easily chilled. He spoke French in the yard and English at school, and by his 10th year he moved between the two, without noticing which one was in his mouth. He was clever in the schoolroom in a modest, hopeful way, and he was, from very early, ambitious. Ambition, in a child of a nurseryman on a small island, took a particular shape. It looked outward. It looked at the packet from Southampton coming in on the tide. It looked at the boys who came back from a season on the mainland with new coats and stories, and it made up its mind, without saying so, that it would not spend a life in a potting shed. There was a piety in him too, and I mention it because it will matter. His parents were of the Reformed Church, and they held their faith the way island people hold most things, without much showing of it and without much letting go. Émile went to chapel with them as a boy, and he went on going to chapel as a young man on his own, and he read his Bible in the evenings, in whatever room he found himself in. He wrote later, when he was courting, of his prayers, and he wrote as though prayer were a habit of his day and not a show he put on for a girl. Whether that piety was deep or shallow, the record does not really tell us. It was at the least real enough that people who lived near him noticed it. At 15 he was sent to work in St. Helier as a boy in a warehouse, and at 18 he crossed the Channel for the first time to take a clerk's place with a firm of seedsmen in the south of France. He was there perhaps 2 years. He learned to keep books in a French counting house, and he learned the little cruelties of a lodging in a strange town, and he learned that a young man alone on the continent could, if he did not watch himself, spend more than he earned on a coat that would impress no one at home. He wrote to his mother often, and his mother kept the letters, and long after everything else in this story was finished, those letters would still exist, folded in a drawer in St. Helier, in the hand of a boy who had not yet learned what his life was going to cost him. By the middle of the 1840s he had come back to the islands, and then, restless again, he had crossed to the mainland of Britain proper for the first time, to try his fortune in Edinburgh. What drew him north I cannot tell you with any real certainty. He had no family in Scotland. He had no friends there beyond a name or two given him by a merchant on the island. He went, I think, because Edinburgh in those years was a city that could still surprise a young man, and because a warehouse in a Scottish town paid better than a warehouse in Jersey, and because he was of an age when a change of place feels like a change of self. He took lodgings there. He took a clerk's stool in a firm that dealt in wines. He walked out on Sundays along Prince's Street with his hat brushed and his boots polished, and he wrote letters home in which he described the new town buildings as though he had built them himself. Edinburgh did not, in the end, hold him. He was a Frenchman by tongue and a Jerseyman by birth, and Edinburgh, in the 1840s, was a city that did not always know what to do with either. He was passed over for a place he had thought his. He was, on one occasion at least, made to feel the coldness a foreign name could earn in a Scottish counting-house. He grew low. He wrote to his mother of a discouragement he was ashamed of. He walked one autumn evening out to Arthur's Seat with the intention, so a friend later said, of throwing himself into whatever lay at the foot of it, and he walked back down again toward his lodging in the dark without having done it, and he did not speak of that walk to anyone for a long time afterwards. Whether the story is exactly true or a shape a friend gave it after the fact, I honestly do not know. What is certain is that the young clerk from St. Helier passed through a season in Edinburgh that hurt him, and that when the chance came to move west to Glasgow he took it, and did not look back. It is Glasgow that we need him in. It is a Glasgow that was, by our winter, one of the great commercial cities of the empire, and a city that could absorb a young Frenchman with a warehouse hand and a good copperplate almost without noticing him. He arrived in the early 1850s. He took a clerk's place with a firm called Huggins and Company, seedsmen and produce merchants, whose warehouse and counting-house stood in one of the wynds off the Trongate, close to the river. His work was ordinary enough. He entered consignments in the ledger in a clear, sloping script. He wrote out invoices. He made up parcels. He kept the correspondence with growers in France and in the Low Countries. He earned, so far as the surviving papers show, a wage of a little under £1 a week, out of which he paid for his room and his board and his coats and his walks along Sauchiehall Street on a Sunday. The lodging he found himself in, and where the death that anchors this story will one day occur, was in a district called Franklin Place, a short row of respectable working houses on the north side of the city, not far from his warehouse. His landlady was a woman named Mrs. Anne Jenkins, a widow of middle years who kept a clean house and set a plain table and let out her front rooms to single men of the clerking sort. There were 2 or 3 other lodgers in the house through the years he was there. There was a maid who came in by the day to do the fires and the pots. There was a cat on the stairs. There was a smell of boiled mutton on a Thursday, because Thursday was a mutton night, and there was a smell of the soap Mrs. Jenkins made herself in a kettle in the wash-house, because Mrs. Jenkins believed shop soap was a waste of a shilling, and would tell you so if you asked. Émile had the front room on the ground floor. It was not a large room, but it was, for a young clerk in Glasgow, better than he might have had. It held an iron bedstead against one wall, and a plain deal chest of drawers against the other, and a washstand under the window with a china basin and jug. It held a small table where he took his breakfast when he took it in his room, and a straight-backed chair he wrote his letters at, and a shelf above the bed on which he kept perhaps a dozen books, most of them French, and a Bible in English. The window looked out into the street, and the street was one of those Glasgow streets where the horse traffic went by all day and stopped only in the deepest small hours. He rose there at 6:30 on a working day. He walked to his warehouse by 7. He came back at 7 in the evening, and he ate his supper at 8, and he sat by the small coal fire in his room and read until 10, and he was in bed and asleep on any ordinary night before 11. That is a life, I know. It is the life of a great many young men in a great many cities in that century, and there is nothing about it, on the face of it, that leads to poison in a drawing-room. What lifted Émile out of that ordinary shape and led him toward the tall grey house on Blythswood Square was the other half of him. He was, off the counting stool, a young man with a strong feeling for himself. He dressed above his purse. He carried, when he could afford one, a stick with a silver band. He wore his hair a little longer than the Glasgow style called for. He walked with a self-conscious grace. He believed, in a way most of the clerks around him did not, that his life was a story, and that the story was going to be a fine one, and he wrote letters to his mother in a hand that sometimes had to work at not sounding grand. He made friends, in his years in Glasgow, in a small way. There was a man called Robert Baird who worked in the same trade and drank a glass of ale with him on a Saturday night. There was a man called Kennedy who came out of the same lodging-house one evening a week to walk with him along the river. There was a young Frenchman, a music teacher, who read the Paris papers with him in a coffee-house on the Trongate on a Sunday afternoon. He kept up his church, or his form of it, and he was seen at the French Protestant congregation that met in a hired hall not far from George Square. He was, in all these small associations, a young man of habit. He was, in the private ledger of his own heart, a young man in waiting. What he was waiting for he perhaps could not have named himself. What he wanted was not, I think, only a woman. It was a life. It was a house of his own, and a place in it that was his, and a name on a brass plate above a door, and a wife at a table who did not have to ask her mother's permission before she poured his tea. The Channel Islands could not give him that. Edinburgh had refused him. Glasgow, so far, had put him in a front room in Franklin Place with a shelf of books and a coal fire and a Bible, and had left him there. He was 33 when we come to him now. He was not old. He was not, by any measure his own family would have used, a failure. He was, however, a young man who had begun to feel time pressing at his back, and to look, on his walks along Sauchiehall Street on a Sunday afternoon, at the daughters of the Glasgow merchants going in and out of the shops, and to allow himself to imagine, without quite saying it out loud, that one of them might one day take his arm. He did not know her name. He had not seen her face. He walked past the corner of West Regent Street, and past the confectioner, and past the tea-room, where the two Miss Somethings kept their table, and he lifted his hat to the ladies who lifted their eyes to him, and he went home to Franklin Place in the dusk, and lit his candle, and opened his Bible, and read a chapter, and blew the candle out. Somewhere, on the same city, at the same hour, a girl in a basement room on Blythswood Square was closing the door on her bundle of letters and turning down her own light. Between them, on the pavements of Sauchiehall Street, a mutual acquaintance was already walking about his own affairs, entirely unaware that in a matter of weeks he would stop between them on a wet March afternoon, and would set his hand on the young clerk's sleeve, and would turn him toward a young woman in a bonnet, and would say the words that would begin everything that was to come. Chapter 3 is complete, approximately 2,560 words, opens with a companion voice handoff to the Channel Islands, keeps Émile's history in third person, admits gaps in the record 3 times, almost nothing else. Does, I cannot tell you with any real certainty, I honestly do not know, and ends leaning forward into the Sauchiehall Street introduction that opens Chapter 4. A meeting on Sauchiehall Street. Come with me now onto a pavement in Glasgow on a wet afternoon in the early spring of 1855. The rain of the morning has thinned to a fine grey drizzle that hangs in the air rather than falls, and the paving stones have that dark shine they take on when the wet has soaked into them, but the puddles have not yet had time to gather. Sauchiehall Street lies ahead of us, running west out of the old grid of the city, into the newer, richer streets that James Smith and men like him had helped to build. We stand for a moment at the corner, out of the way of the umbrellas, and we watch. This is where the story turns. The street in that year was one of the great parades of Glasgow. It was not, yet, the wide boulevard of later photographs. It was narrower than we might picture. The pavements were flagged with grey stone, and the roadway between them was granite set, and the drains along the curbs carried a slow, constant trickle of the day's rain. On one side and the other stood the shop fronts the city was becoming proud of, a linen draper with bolts of cambric in the window, a milliner with 3 straw bonnets on wire stands, a tobacconist whose sign was a wooden Highlander with a snuff mull in his hand, a bookseller with a rack of the Edinburgh Review outside the door, and a boy in a canvas apron sweeping wet leaves off the step. There was a confectioner 2 doors along whose window was full of glass jars of striped sweets, and a chemist across the way whose window held the great blue and green bottles of coloured water that were the sign of his trade all over Britain in that decade. Into that street, on any dry afternoon between 2 and 4, came the daughters and the wives of the west end of the city. They came in pairs mostly, arm in arm, in shawls or short coats over their frocks, with a maid 2 paces behind carrying the parcels. They went into the draper's and came out with a slip of paper and no parcel, because the parcel would be sent up in the evening by the boy. They went into the milliner and came out with nothing at all, because to look at bonnets in the afternoon and to buy them was not, in that class, the same thing. They stopped at the confectioner for a paper twist of comfits for a younger sister at home. They nodded at the friends they knew. They did not, on the whole, meet the eyes of the men. Madeleine Smith walked on that street that afternoon, with her sister Bessie beside her. She was 20 years of age. She wore a dress of dark green wool cut close at the waist, a short cloth mantle across her shoulders, and a bonnet in the shape of the year, tied under her chin with a broad ribbon of the same green. She had gloves of dark kid and a silk bag on her wrist, and she walked with the particular Glasgow gait of a young woman who has been told all her life not to hurry. Bessie was 2 years younger and half a head shorter, and she carried a paper parcel from the draper's because the maid had been sent home earlier with an armful. The 2 sisters had come out together after their dinner, at their mother's leave, to walk as far as the corner of Renfield Street and back. Émile Langelier had come up the same street from the other direction. He had left his warehouse an hour early, which was a thing he did once in a while when the ledger was closed for the week and Mr. Huggins was out at his own business. He had gone back to Franklin Place and changed his coat. He wore, that afternoon, a dark frock coat that he had had made in Edinburgh and had never quite paid off, a waistcoat of a lighter cloth beneath it, a stock tied at his throat in the French way, and a hat that was a season out of the London style, but was newly brushed. He carried a stick with a brass knob. He walked with the self-conscious care of a man who knows exactly what he looks like and who wants to look like it well. Between them, on the same pavement, walked a young man called Robert Baird. Baird was a Glasgow clerk of the sort Émile knew from the counting houses, a good-natured, easy sort of person who moved between the merchant families and the young men from the warehouses without much minding which side of that line he was on for the moment. He had known Émile for a year or so. He knew the Smith girls by sight from a wedding party the previous summer, at which he had been introduced to their brother and, in passing, to Bessie. He was, that afternoon, on no errand in particular. He was simply walking off a dinner. He was, in the way of these histories, in exactly the place that mattered. I have to say plainly here that the record of what happened next has been told in more than one way. Some who spoke of it later placed the introduction on a Sunday afternoon, and some on a weekday. Some remembered it in front of the milliner, and some outside the bookseller. Baird himself said, when he was asked long after, that it had come about very simply and without any planning, and that he had not thought anything of it at the time. What is certain, and what nobody has ever disputed, is that the three of them met on a pavement of Sauchiehall Street in the early weeks of 1855, and that Baird raised his hat to the Miss Smiths, and that he then turned, and with a brief gesture, presented to them the young Frenchman at his side. The words he used are lost. Something ordinary, I imagine. A name, a place of business, a mention of the seed trade. Bessie curtsied. Madeleine gave the half-bow of a young lady in the street. Émile lifted his hat and held it in his hand. The rain hung about them. A cab went past behind them, throwing up a fine spray from a puddle at the curb. The whole exchange lasted, at the outside, 1 minute. Baird moved on. The Smith sisters turned back into their walk. Émile stood for another moment at the corner with his hat still off, and then put it back on and went in the other direction. That was the meeting. That was the whole of it. Out of it, in time, would come a scandal that filled the newspapers of 2 kingdoms. You must not imagine, and this matters, that anything was said in that minute that had any weight in it. There was no confession of feeling. There was no lingering look. There was scarcely, on Madeleine's side, a recognition that the young man at Baird's shoulder was any different from a dozen young men she had been presented to in the same way in the same year. Bessie remembered him better than her sister did, and only because his coat had been unusual and his accent had not been Glasgow. He might have gone home to Franklin Place, taken off his good coat, hung it in the wardrobe, and never crossed her mind again. He might have. He did not. What we know is that within a few days he had asked Baird for the Smiths' address. Within a further few he had contrived to be on the same pavement at the same hour, and to lift his hat again, and to be nodded to in return. Within a fortnight he had learned that the family attended a Presbyterian church on Sunday mornings, and that Madeleine sometimes walked out with her sister in the afternoons along Buchanan Street. He was, from the first, more taken than the moment warranted. In some private way of his own, he was already in love with the idea of her before he had exchanged 3 sentences with the person she was. Come away from the pavement with me for a moment and up the flight of steps at Blythswood Square into the drawing-room on the first floor, where the household was that same evening. Janet Smith sat at her work-table near the window with a piece of embroidery she had been at for a fortnight. James Smith was in the back room he called his study, going over an elevation for a building on West George Street. Bessie, still in her walking dress, told her mother in a light voice about the shops they had looked into and the people they had met. She mentioned Mr. Baird by name, because Baird was an acquaintance of the family. She did not, so far as we can tell, mention the young man at his side. Madeleine sat with her feet tucked under her on a low stool and let her sister do the talking. If anyone had asked her what she was thinking, she would have said, and truthfully, nothing very much at all. The record does not tell us the exact hour or the exact day when that changed. It changed by degrees, in the way real things do. A second nod on the street, and a third. A letter of introduction sent through Baird, with a very particular sentence at the foot, in which the young clerk asked, most respectfully, whether he might be permitted to call. A short, formal note back, in Madeleine's own hand, saying that a call would not be possible, and that she thanked him for the compliment, and that she trusted the matter would go no further. That reply, so proper on its face, was the kind of reply that told a determined man he had been seen. Émile answered. Of course he answered. He wrote in French to begin with, and then in English, when he understood she read English more easily than she read French. He wrote in a careful hand, and on paper he had bought new for the purpose. He said that he had thought of nothing but their meeting since. He said that he was aware of the difference in their station. He said that he asked no more than to be permitted to write to her, and to be answered, and that he would leave the deciding of it entirely to her. He signed himself, in the way he would sign every letter of the whole affair from that day onward, as her devoted Émile. Madeleine took that letter down to her basement room and read it, and folded it, and put it into a drawer under a stack of muslin collars, and did not answer it for 3 days. What she thought in those 3 days we do not know. She left no diary. Her later letters to Émile, when they came, would run to hundreds of pages and would tell him everything about her days and her fears and her longings, but they would not go back to the beginning and describe for him what it had felt like to hold his first letter in her hand. That silence in the record has to stand. All we can say is that on the 4th day she took up her pen at the little desk under the window in her basement room, and she wrote him a short, polite, and entirely improper reply. From there, and I want you to hold this in your mind as you go into sleep tonight, the two of them began to write to one another. Not to meet. Not to be seen together. Not to be spoken of in any drawing room in Glasgow. Only to write. Letters passed between Franklin Place and Blythswood Square by the ordinary post at first, and then, when that grew too visible, through the hand of a friend of Émile's, a Miss Mary Perry, who lived alone in a set of rooms not far from the warehouse, and who could be trusted to carry a folded sheet in a reticule without asking what was inside it. It was in those pages, and not on the pavement of Sauchiehall Street, that the courtship truly began. It was in those pages that the girl in the green wool dress and the young man in the Edinburgh coat left behind the persons they had been on the street, and became, to one another, something else entirely. The father in the study, going over his elevations. The mother at her embroidery. The sister with her light chatter. The house at Blythswood Square kept its shape above her, and she slept beneath it, and each morning she went up to the drawing-room and took her tea and asked after her father's work and let the day close over her. In the drawer under the muslin collars the letters grew. There were 3 of them by the end of the month, and a dozen by the end of the summer, and by the winter that followed the drawer would no longer hold them all, and she would have begun to keep them in a second place. It is those pages that we turn to now, and it is in them, more than in any street or drawing-room, that Madeleine Smith becomes the woman who will one day walk into a chemist's shop in the last winter of her freedom and sign her name in a poison book without her hand shaking. The letters in the drawer. I'll write chapter 5 now, keeping it approximately 2,500 words, with the companion voice touching down at scene seams and leaning forward into the basement window. Let me begin the chapter drafting directly. Come with me down the stair, then, to the basement room at number 7 Blythswood Square, on an afternoon in the early summer of that same year. The house above is quiet in the way houses go quiet in the middle of a working day. The father is at his office on West George Street. The mother is out with the younger children at a fitting for a set of frocks. The maid is in the wash-house at the back, boiling a copper of linens. A blackbird is turning over the leaves in the little garden across the square, and the sound of a cab wheel goes past on the far side and fades. In the front basement room, with the tall window that gives on to the sunken area, a young woman is bent over a small writing desk. Her pen is French, ivory-handled, a birthday gift from a cousin in Rowe. The paper is her father's household stock. The words she is putting down on it are, in every plain sense of the word, hers. Madeleine kept 2 places for the letters she wrote, and 2 more for the letters she received. That is the first thing to hold in your mind. Her own drafts, when she made them, went into a pigeonhole at the back of that little desk, behind a false partition her father would never have noticed even if he had ever come into her room, which he did not. Émile's letters came in through the ordinary post at first, addressed in his careful French copperplate to Miss Smith at Blythswood Square, and were carried in on the salver by the maid, along with the day's other post, and left in the hall on a rosewood table. Madeleine collected them as she passed. She read them once quickly at the hall table, and then took them down to her basement room, and read them again with the door shut. When she had read them a second time, she put them into the drawer of a low chest under a folded shawl, and the shawl was of a pattern she alone in the house wore. I have to tell you, quite honestly, that we do not know how many letters passed between them in the first months of the courtship. The great mass of correspondence that survives, and that would one day be laid out on tables in a courtroom in Edinburgh, comes from the second year and the third. Of the first summer we have only fragments, and of the very first weeks perhaps a page or two on either side. Madeleine, in the years to come, would burn what she was afraid of. Émile, from the beginning, kept everything she sent him in a black tin box in the front room at Franklin Place, wrapped in ribbon and tied by month. That box, and the choices of the girl who was writing into it, will matter later. For the summer of the meeting on Sauchiehall Street, the record is a little thinner than I would like it to be, and I will tell you where I am guessing and where I am on solid ground. What is on solid ground is that by the middle of that first summer they were writing to one another 2 and 3 times a week. The ordinary post through the hall had already begun to feel dangerous to her, and the two of them had settled on a small routine that would, in various shapes, hold for the whole of the courtship. Émile's friend, Miss Mary Perry, a spinster of about 40, who lived in 2 rooms on the same side of the city as his warehouse, agreed to take his letters as though they were her own. She addressed her hand, which was rounder and more feminine than his, on the outer envelope. Inside was a second envelope in his script, and inside that was the letter proper. When the post came into the hall at Blythswood Square, the outer envelope, in a woman's writing, from a Miss Perry no one in the house had heard of, drew no attention. Madeleine had told her mother, at some point in the early weeks, that Miss Perry was the sister of a friend from school. Nobody asked further. The letters came through. She wrote back by the same route. Her own letters went out, in a plain sealed envelope, to Miss Perry's address, and were opened there by Émile in the evening when he called at Miss Perry's parlour after his day at Huggins. Sometimes he read them at once, in Miss Perry's window seat, with the older woman quiet at her needlework at the other end of the room. Sometimes he took them home to Franklin Place and read them by his coal fire with the door locked. Miss Perry, I should say, did not read either of them. She was a religious woman, unmarried, sober, and she believed a young man ought to be helped in what she thought of, in the language of her generation, as an attachment. She would say later, when it all came out, that she had never in her life imagined the letters going through her hand were of the character they were. I believe her. It is hard to imagine, in that plain, sensible woman, any other kind of belief. Now let me say something about the letters themselves, and I want you to hear it in the tone in which I mean it, because the plain fact of them is one of the surprising things in this whole history. Madeleine wrote to Émile in a way no respectable girl of her class and year was ever meant to write to a man not her husband. She used his Christian name from very early. She wrote of her longing to see him. She wrote of the touch of his hand at their few chance meetings. She wrote, before very long, of nights she had spent in her basement room, thinking of him with a directness that had nothing schoolroom about it at all. She wrote to him as his wife. She called herself his wife in the letters, months before there was any question of a marriage. She signed herself Mimi, which was the name he had given her, and she called him her own dear husband, and she meant, as far as her own understanding of the world went at 21, exactly what those words say. You have to hold 2 things at once here. The first is that Madeleine Smith was a young woman of a particular class, in a particular year, in a particular city, and that the class and year and city all told her, in every hour of every day, what she was and was not allowed to be. She dressed in the frocks her mother chose. She walked out with the sister her father approved of. She went to the church his family had gone to for 2 generations. She was to marry a man from a house of the same standing as her father's, and she was to bring him a portion, and she was to make him a wife, and she was to raise his children in a drawing-room of the same shape as the one above her head. That was the frame she was given. That was the frame every young woman of Blythswood Square had been given for the whole of her waking life. The second thing is that inside that frame, in the basement room with the door shut and the pen in her hand and the shawl over the drawer, she was doing something no frame permitted. She was writing to a foreign clerk of no fortune, on paper her father's household had paid for, that she loved him and would live with him and would never live with any other man. She was, week by week, becoming a person the drawing-room upstairs did not know. She was doing it on purpose, and she was doing it, so far as any reading of the letters can tell us, with a real, warm, breathing feeling for the man on the other end of them, and not, or not only, out of any romantic performance for herself. Émile wrote back. That has to be said, and it has to be said fairly. He wrote her long letters in a hand that filled the page. He wrote her his hopes for a house of their own, and his careful sums for what a clerk and a merchant's daughter might live on if they were prudent, and his fear that her father would refuse him. He wrote her his religious feelings, and his pride in her, and his shame in what he did not yet have to offer her. He wrote her a fair number of things that later readers, sitting in cool rooms with the whole outcome laid before them, would call cold or calculating. I am not sure that is entirely fair to him. He was a young man in love with a young woman above him in the world, and he was frightened, and he wrote to her out of the frightenedness of it, and that is very often what men in that position have written. What is fair to say is that his letters from very early contained a note of jealousy and of control that hers did not, and that as time went on that note grew louder. He asked her to describe every ball she went to. He asked her which men had stood near her at supper. He warned her against a Miss So-and-so on the grounds that Miss So-and-so's brother had spoken slightingly of him at the warehouse. He set out, in a letter of the second summer, a list of the things he would expect of her once they were married, in a tone that a modern ear would call ugly, and that a Glasgow ear of that year would perhaps not have noticed. She answered him softly. She promised him. She wrote him what he wanted to hear. The Smith family took the house at Rower Lane every year from the middle of summer to the beginning of autumn. Rower Lane was a stone villa on the western shore of the Garraloch, at the little settlement of Row, some 30 miles by road and steamer from Glasgow. It had a garden that ran down to a low wall, and a wicket gate in the wall, and beyond the gate a path through a stretch of rough grass to the shingle at the water's edge. James Smith had bought the place a few years before and rebuilt it to his own drawing. It was, in his mind, the reward of his hardest years. In summer he would come out from town by the steamer on a Saturday and go back on a Monday morning, and his wife and daughters would stay at Rower Lane through the whole of the warm weather. The letters, in those months, no longer went through Miss Perry. They went by the country post to the little office at Row, addressed to Madeleine in a plain hand, and were fetched from there by Madeleine herself in the course of her daily walk to the shore. She wrote to him from the small parlour that gave on to the water, with the window open onto the sound of the loch and a wood pigeon in the fir trees behind the house. She wrote of the boats going up and down. She wrote of her father's mood at breakfast. She wrote of the maids and their gossip, and of a walk with her sister as far as the point at Rue, and of a picnic on the shingle with a party of cousins in which she had had to smile at a young man from Row whom her father was already beginning to speak of by name. That young man, whose name at Rue was William Minnock, will step onto the pavement of this story in his own chapter, and I will say no more of him tonight than that. What I want you to see now is only that even at Rower Lane, 30 miles from Blythswood Square, on holiday, in the sun, with the loch at the foot of the garden, Madeleine was in her writing room every morning after breakfast, with the door shut and her pen in her hand, and Émile's last letter open beside her. The correspondence did not pause when she left the city. If anything, at Rower Lane, with more of her day her own, it grew. We do not know, and I want to be honest with you about this, exactly when the two of them became lovers in the plain, physical sense of the word. The letters themselves are the only witness, and the letters, though they say a great deal, do not date the change with any precision. What is certain is that by the summer of the second year the tone had passed beyond words, and had entered into a shared memory of nights, whose particulars the writers did not need to spell out to each other. There is a letter from Rower Lane, from the middle of that summer, in which Madeleine speaks of a night at Blythswood Square before she left town, in terms that admit no other reading. There is another, from the following spring, in which she calls him her husband before God, and asks his forgiveness for a moment of coldness the week before, and reminds him that no one else will ever have of her what he has had. Those are her words. It is not for me to soften them. The drawer under the shawl in the basement room could not by then hold what she had. She kept a second store of his letters in a locked box on the top of the wardrobe, wrapped in brown paper as though it held a bonnet from the year before. She kept a third, later, on the shelf in a linen press in the passage, disguised inside an envelope her mother had used and thrown out. What she never did, in all the 2 years and more of the correspondence, was destroy any letter of his. That was, in the end, one of the reasons the story was ever told at all. His letters to her would not survive her final months, because at a certain point in the winter that was coming, she would sit down and burn most of them in her own grate. But her letters to him would survive in the black tin box at Franklin Place, and would, when the tin box was opened in a stranger's hand, deliver the whole of her private life into the light. The house above her went on with its own hours. The clock under the glass dome kept its time. The father worked at his elevations. The mother turned her embroidery. The sister sang at the piano in the drawing room on a Thursday evening. Below them, in the basement room with the tall window on the sunken area, Madeleine sealed her letter and put it into her pocket and drew her shawl over her shoulders, and she opened the door of her room and closed it softly behind her. The correspondence, on paper, could carry a good deal. It could not carry everything. Autumn was drawing in on Blythswood Square. The nights were beginning to lengthen, and Émile Langelier, 3 streets away in his front room at Franklin Place, had begun to write to her that a letter, however loving, was no longer enough for him, and that he must, before the winter set in, be permitted to come to her at the house itself, at an hour when the household above would not know he was there. Chapter 5 complete, approximately 2,540 words, opens with a companion voice hand-off to the basement writing desk, keeps the letter correspondence and Émile's growing possessiveness in third person, admits the record's gaps 3 times. First weeks are thin, timing of the physical shift, Miss Perry's honest ignorance, varies sentence openings, cedes William Minnock for Chapter 7 without teasing, and ends leaning forward into Émile's demand to come to the house, the basement window of Chapter 6. The basement window. Come with me back into the front basement room at number 7, on a wet evening in the late autumn of 1855. The gas has been lit in the lamp on the far wall, and the flame is low. A coal fire is going in the little grate, and the coals have burned down to the red stage where they give more warmth than light. The tall window that faces onto the sunken area at the front of the house is shut against the weather, and the curtain across it is drawn only halfway, because Madeleine has been at her desk and has wanted the last of the daylight for as long as it would give her ink to write by. Above her head, 3 flights up in the drawing room, her mother is at the piano with Bessie beside her. The 2 of them are picking through a piece by Mendelssohn, and now and then a wrong note comes down through the floor and is corrected and tried again. James Smith is in his study at the back of the house, with a decanter at his elbow and a plan of a warehouse spread out under his hand. The maids are in the kitchen at the far end of the basement passage, boiling potatoes for the servants' supper. Nobody in the house is thinking of the sunken area at the front, into which a young man in a wet coat is at that very moment coming down the iron steps from the pavement. The area at the front of a Glasgow townhouse of that year was a thing built into the design of the street. It was a rectangle of open air, 6 or 7 feet deep, cut down into the ground between the front of the house and the pavement. A short flight of iron steps ran down into it from the pavement above, guarded at the top by a low gate. At the bottom of the area were 2 doors, one for the coal cellar at the front, and one for the tradesman's entrance at the side, through which the fishmonger and the coalman and the boy from the grocer's came in the mornings. The area also had a window. This was the window of the front basement room, tall, sash, with iron bars fixed across it on the outside, to keep the tradesman from wandering in, and to keep the coal dust from the cellar out of the room. It was Madeleine's window. It gave onto nothing but the sunken area and the underside of the pavement and, beyond the iron rails at the top, the base of a gas lamp on the far side of the square. Émile Langelier came down those steps for the first time on an evening in the last week of October or the first week of November of that year. I cannot give you the exact date. The letters that mention it were written days after the fact, and speak of it as though it were already an old habit between them, and the earliest account we have from anyone else was set down more than a year later, when nobody could quite remember which week it had first been. What is certain is that he came, and that once he had come, he came again, and that within a few weeks the visits had settled into a shape that would hold, off and on, for the whole of the second year of the affair. The shape was this. Madeleine sat in her basement room after the household had gone up. Her father, at 10, took his last glass and went up to bed. Her mother, before 11, followed. Bessie was already asleep. The maids, by 10:30, had banked the kitchen fire and gone to their own rooms at the top of the house. From about 11 onward, the house above her belonged, in effect, to no one. Madeleine kept the coals going in her little grate, and sat with a book on her lap and listened. Somewhere between midnight and 1, when the pavements of Blythswood Square had gone quiet, and the last cab of the evening had rolled away towards Sauchiehall Street, there would come a soft, careful step on the iron treads outside. She would rise. She would go to the window. She would push the curtain aside with one hand and look out through the bars into the sunken well beyond, and she would see him standing there. He came on foot every time. He walked from his lodging at Franklin Place, out through the streets of the West End, and up the length of West George Street to the square. In dry weather, it was a walk of about 20 minutes. In the wet, in his good boots and the frock coat he could not afford to replace, it was longer, because he took the sheltered side of every street. He came in a low, dark coat that he had bought expressly for these walks, a coat plain enough not to be remembered by a policeman on his beat, and he wore a soft cap in place of his usual hat. He carried nothing with him but a letter for her, folded small in an inner pocket. He did not knock. He did not call. He went down the iron steps into the area with the careful weight of a man used to going downstairs in the dark, and he stood against the wall in the shadow the pavement above threw down into the well, and he waited for her at the window. The first thing that passed between them at the grate, and I want you to hear this because it is easy to lose sight of in the great heap of what came after, was talk. Ordinary, murmured, low talk. He told her about his day at the warehouse. She told him about the visitors who had come to the drawing-room in the afternoon. He asked her whether her father had spoken of him, and she told him her father did not know he existed. He asked her whether she had received his last letter, and she told him she had, and had put it under the shawl with the others. Then, sometimes, he would pass a folded letter through the bars, and she would take it in her fingers and slip it into the pocket of her dressing gown, and sometimes she would push a folded letter out to him, and he would take it in his hand and put it into the inner pocket of his coat. They were, in the plain sense, sweethearts at a window, and half of what they did there was the ordinary talk of sweethearts anywhere. The other half was less ordinary, and it began, on the record, with a cup of cocoa. Madeleine had asked him one night whether he was cold. He had said, with the little laugh of a young man who does not want to be pitied, that he was warm enough. She had gone away from the window and had come back a few minutes later with a china cup between her hands, steaming. She had pushed it out to him through the bars. He had taken it. He had drunk it standing there in the wet coat with the cup held in both hands. He had passed the empty cup back through the bars to her. She had washed it in the little basin in the corner of her room and had put it away on a shelf. This was, for months, the small ritual of the basement window. She would go up the passage to the kitchen, quietly, in her slippers, and would heat a pan of milk on the range that the maid had left banked but still warm. She would stir in cocoa and a spoon of sugar. She would carry the cup back along the passage in the dark and would push it through the bars to him. The maid, in the mornings, would find the pan washed and the shelf tidy, and would think, if she thought anything at all, that her young mistress had been at the milk in the night. I want to say plainly at this point that the two of them were not at the window alone in any physical sense. There were bars between them. The window itself was shut against the cold. Whatever was passed between them was passed through iron. The visits, of themselves, were not the moment at which anything crossed a line the drawing-room upstairs would have wanted uncrossed. That line, if we are going to speak of it, had been crossed already, in the letters, months before, and would be crossed again, in another room, on a night we cannot exactly date. What the basement window gave them was not privacy of that kind. What it gave them was time. 20 minutes at the grate, 3 or 4 nights a week, in which two people who could not be seen together in a shop or on a pavement or in the church porch could stand within a foot of one another and speak in their own voices, and in which the girl above the area could believe, for that 20 minutes, that the frame around her life had a door in it that opened onto him. I honestly do not know how many nights in that first winter he came. Madeleine, later, in a letter she wrote from Rower Lane the following summer, spoke of him having come to the window 3 times in 1 week, and then not at all for a fortnight, and of her lying awake on those empty nights, and going to the window at 1, and staying there for an hour, with her hand on the sash before she went back to bed. Émile, in a letter of his own from the same season, spoke of a night on which he had walked all the way to Blythswood Square in a hard frost, and had found her window dark and the area empty, and had understood only in the morning that her mother had taken her out to a supper party at a house on West Regent Street, and had kept her there until midnight. The nights, whatever their exact number, were their own weather. The two of them lived by them. Émile grew braver. That, I am afraid, is the plain word for it, and it is one of the small unhappinesses of this story. In the first weeks he stood only at the window and drank the cocoa and went. By the middle of the winter he was asking her, softly, whether the door of her room, the door that gave from the basement room into the passage of the house, could not be unlocked. Madeleine, in the letters, put him off. She told him her father sometimes came down in the night for a book. She told him the maid had been ill and had slept on a truckle bed in the passage. She told him the wood of the door swelled in the wet weather and creaked on its hinges. She had reasons enough, and I think she meant most of them, and I think there was also in her a proper fear of what she was already, in the letters, calling their marriage before God. Émile pressed. She held. He pressed again. She held again. And then, on a night we cannot fix, she gave. Let me speak carefully here. The record on what happened next is thin, on purpose. The letters that describe it were among the letters Madeleine would later, in the last winter, take from the drawer under the shawl and burn one by one in the little grate of that same basement room. What survives is Émile's side, and Émile's side speaks in careful, coded terms that were meant to remind and not to reveal. What the two of them wrote to one another about it later, at Rower Lane and at Blythswood Square, and across the second summer and the third, does not spell out a date or an hour or a chair or a bed. What it does make plain, in more than one place, is that at some point in the winter of 1855 to 56, the door of the basement room was quietly unlocked from the inside, and Émile came in from the sunken area, not to the bars of the window, but into the room itself, and the two of them, after weeks of standing on either side of an iron grate, at last stood on the same side of it. Whatever passed between them in that room and on the nights that followed it, they both, from that point on, spoke of themselves in their letters as married in the sight of heaven, and Madeleine wrote, in a letter of the following spring, that no one else on this earth would ever have of her what he had had. You have to hold in your mind, if you can, how completely alone she was in that decision. There was no mother she could go to. There was no sister she could confide in. There was no clergyman in Blythswood Square to whom the truth of what she had done, or was doing, could safely be told. There was no woman friend of her own age who was not, in some way, a daughter of the same drawing rooms and bound by the same rules. There was only Émile at the window, and Émile in the room, and Émile in the letters, and the shawl in the drawer, and the little cup washed and put back on the shelf before the maid came down in the morning. That was the whole of her counsel. That was the whole of her company in the matter. When you consider, later, the things she did in the last winter, it is worth remembering this, that for the 2 years leading up to them she had, in the deepest matter of her life, no one at all to speak to but the man who was walking home along Great Western Road at 2 in the morning with her letter in his pocket. The house above went on with its own weather. James Smith, in the spring that was coming, would take his family for a Sunday's drive out to the villages north of the city, and would speak, in the carriage, of a young merchant of Glasgow whose father he had known for 20 years. Janet Smith, at her work table, would begin, in the same spring, to speak more often than before of the propriety of a suitable establishment for her eldest daughter. Bessie, at the piano, would learn a new piece and would play it at a party in West Regent Street, to which the same young merchant had also been invited. None of them had any idea that below their feet, night after night, a foreign clerk in a plain coat was coming down an iron stair into the sunken area at the front of their house. None of them had any idea that the daughter they were beginning so carefully to steer toward a marriage of their own choosing had already given her word, in ink and in whispered talk through iron bars, to a man they did not know existed. The gas lamp burned on the far side of the square. The rain fell into the sunken well. The cup went out through the bars and came back empty. And somewhere in the west end of the city, in a drawing room she had not yet sat in, a merchant of 32 called William Minnock was, at that very season, being told by a friend that James Smith of Blythswood Square had a daughter who was said to be very handsome, and that a call, at a proper hour, would perhaps not be unwelcome. The Suitor from Rue. Let me step out of the basement room now, and up the iron stair into the pavement of Blythswood Square on an afternoon in the early spring of 1856. The rain has gone off. The paving is drying in patches. A hansom is drawn up at the curb outside number 7, its horse blowing steam into the cold air, and a gentleman in a well-cut brown coat and a good hat is being handed down by the driver. He crosses the pavement in 3 strides. He climbs the front steps. He rings the bell, and the maid who opens the door in her afternoon apron takes his card on a salver and carries it up to the drawing-room, where James Smith and his wife are sitting with a pot of tea between them. The card is a plain rectangle of cream board with a name engraved on it in a fine copper plate. William Harper Minnock. India Street. Merchant. I have to tell you, before we go any further with him, that we know less about William Minnock than we know about almost anyone else in this story, and what we do know we have to piece together from ledger entries and street directories and the little that came out of him in a witness box the following year. He was 32 years old in the spring of 1856. He was born in Rue on the Garraloch, in the same stretch of country to which the Smiths went every summer at Rower Lane. He was the son of a shipmaster who had done well enough to send his boys south to school. He had come into Glasgow as a young man of 19 or 20, and had gone into a trading house on the Broomielaw, and by the age Émile Langelier was still folding cloth at Huggins for 8 shillings a week, William Minnock was already a junior partner in the firm of Holdsworth and Company, and had rooms of his own in a good house at 116 India Street, and kept a horse. He was not a handsome man in the way Émile was handsome. He was tall, spare, dry in the face, with sandy hair already going back from the forehead, and a habit of holding his hat by the brim in front of him when he was in a lady's drawing-room. He spoke rarely, and when he did he spoke well, in the plain, undecorated English of the Glasgow merchant class, with a faint lift at the end of a sentence that belonged to the Garraloch and to nowhere else. He did not laugh often. When he did laugh, according to a clerk who worked in the counting room with him for 11 years, he laughed shortly and stopped as though he had remembered a matter of business. He was, by every account we have, a decent, upright, industrious man, a member of a congregation in the city, a giver to charities, a punctual visitor of his mother in her old age, and, at 32, a bachelor. He had met James Smith years before through the trade. Holdsworth and Company had commissioned buildings on which the elder Smith had drawn the elevations. The two men had sat opposite one another over plans and had agreed on estimates, and had, in the way of two Glasgow men of business, come to think well of one another without ever quite becoming friends. When Minnoch's affairs began to require a small country house of his own on the Garraloch, it was to Smith that he wrote for a design. That letter, and the correspondence that followed it, were, so far as we can now tell, the introduction on which everything else was built. By the summer of 1855, when Émile was walking down West George Street to the basement window, William Minnoch was coming into the parlour at Rower Lane on a Saturday afternoon to talk over drawings with James Smith, and Madeleine, in a white summer dress, was serving him tea on a tray, brought in by one of the girls from the kitchen. She hardly noticed him at first. That, I think, is fair to say. He was one of a number of gentlemen who called on her father, and the calls had, for her, all the greyness of the drawing-room and the ticking of the clock, and the same slice of seed cake on the same plate. Minnoch, for his part, seems to have noticed her at once, and to have said nothing about it for a considerable while. He was not the kind of man who spoke of these things before he was ready. He came to Rower Lane again in August. He came again in September, after the family had returned to town, on a matter of an outbuilding he wished added to the Rue house. He was asked to dinner, informally, in the dining room at Blythswood Square, once in October, and again just before Christmas. Each time he sat opposite Madeleine, ate what was put in front of him, spoke about the trade and about a bridge that was being planned across the Clyde, and about the state of the roads out to Row, and went home in a cab before 11, and neither Madeleine nor anyone else in the house thought anything of it, beyond that a friend of her father's had been to dine. Yet Janet Smith, who was quicker in these matters than her husband was, had begun to see. A mother of a grown daughter in a house of that year had, whatever else she had, a kind of second hearing for what a gentleman did with his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Janet said nothing to Madeleine. She said very little even to James. What she did do, in that spring of '56, was to arrange her drawing-room afternoons so that when a card came up from Mr. Minnoch, Madeleine was in the house, and Madeleine came in with the tea, and Madeleine was left in the room a little longer than the visit required. Madeleine, in the letters to Émile from that spring, mentions Minnoch by name 3 times, and dismisses him each time in half a sentence. A friend of Papa's. A very dull person. He came again on Wednesday and sat for an hour. There is nothing in her writing yet that suggests she had any inkling of what her mother was, without hurry, building up around her. Come with me forward, then, to the middle of the summer of that year, when the family are back at Rower Lane and William Minnoch is out at his own new house at Rue, and the two properties lie within a walk of one another along the shore of the loch. Minnoch calls at Rower Lane, now not in a hansom with a card, but on foot, with a stick under his arm, wearing a country coat and boots for walking. He is asked to stay to tea. He is asked to stay to supper. He is asked to come out with the Smiths in the boat on a Sunday afternoon. Madeleine is put next to him in the stern with a shawl over her shoulders, and Bessie is put in the bow with the boy who rows, and James is at the tiller pretending to notice nothing, and Janet is on the shore with a parasol and a book, and a look of considered patience. Minnoch talks to Madeleine, on that afternoon on the loch, about the country he grew up in, and about the church at Rue, and about a poem by Wordsworth he had once heard read aloud at a school in the north. Madeleine, in the letter she wrote to Émile that night from the parlour at Rower Lane, says only that they had been out in the boat and that she had been bored. I do not entirely believe her. That is a hard thing to write of a woman whose word we have in her own hand, and I want to say it carefully. I think what was happening in her that summer was more complicated than the letter to Émile made room for, and I think she herself did not yet have the words for it. On one side of her there was Émile at the window in her memory, and Émile in the drawer under the shawl, and Émile in the vow before heaven she had already made in her own head. On the other side of her, on the water in the low light of a July evening, there was a sober, decent gentleman of her father's world, sitting a foot away from her in a boat, treating her with an old-fashioned politeness that no one had ever quite shown her before. She was 21. She had grown up inside a set of rules whose whole promise had always been that if she kept them, a marriage of exactly this shape would one day arrive. And here, at last, the marriage of exactly this shape was, in a slow and unmistakable way, arriving. The autumn came in. The family went back to Blythswood Square. Minnoch's calls in town resumed, and now they were unmistakable. He came in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and again on a Friday. He was asked to a supper party in West Regent Street, to which the Smiths had also been invited, and he took Madeleine in to supper on his arm. He escorted her home in the family carriage afterwards, sitting opposite her with his hat on his knees, and he saw her to the door and lifted his hat and went away, and James Smith, at breakfast the next morning, looked at his eldest daughter over the top of his newspaper and said only of Mr. Minnoch that he was a very steady young man. Janet Smith, at the same breakfast, poured a second cup of tea for her husband and said nothing at all, because she had said everything she meant to say in the arrangement of the seating the night before. The letters to Émile through that autumn began, without any single line one could point to change. She still called him her own dear husband. She still signed herself Mimi. She still wrote to him 3 and 4 times a week, and she still went, some nights, to the basement window with a cup of cocoa in her hands. But there is in the letters of that autumn a new note that had not been in them before, and any careful reader can feel it. She writes less about what she longs for and more about what is difficult. She writes of her father's temper and her mother's health and her sister's need of her. She writes of the practical impossibility, for the present, of anything more than they have. She asks Émile, in one letter, whether he has considered emigrating, and whether he might do well in the colonies, and whether she might in time be allowed to follow him there once he was established. Émile, reading these letters at Franklin Place, understood at least in part what he was reading. He wrote back with fresh warmth. He begged her not to lose heart. He reminded her, in a letter of that November, of nights she and he alone remembered. He signed himself, as he always had, her own husband before God. In the last week of January of 1857, in the drawing-room at Blythswood Square, on an afternoon on which James and Janet Smith had contrived, without saying so, to be out of the room together for a full quarter of an hour, William Minnoch offered Madeleine his hand. We do not have the words in which he did it. He was not the kind of man to record them, and she was not, at that moment, the kind of woman who would afterwards write them down. What we have is her letter to a friend the following day, in which she said, in a level tone, that a matter which the family had for some time expected had now been settled, and that she had given Mr. Minnoch her promise, and that her father was very pleased. That is all. There is no exclamation. There is no rush of happiness. There is a plain sentence in a plain hand, and a signature below it, and a date at the top of the page. James Smith was delighted, in the reserved manner of his class. Janet Smith wept a little, in the private way of a mother who has done, without saying so, exactly what she meant to do. A date was not yet named. The engagement would be, for the present, a matter between the two families. A ring was chosen. Announcements would follow in the spring. Minnoch, that same evening, wrote to his own mother at Roux with the news, and his mother wrote back within the week to say that she would be very glad to receive her son's chosen wife at the earliest opportunity. The household at Blythswood Square, in the days after the engagement, went about its business with a new brightness of manner. The clock under the glass dome kept its time. The maid brushed the front steps. A dressmaker was sent for. Nobody in the house, and nobody in the household at India Street, and nobody in the drawing rooms of Blythswood Square had any idea of what was, at that same moment, being written and sealed in the basement room downstairs and carried up the passage in the pocket of a shawl. Madeleine wrote to Émile in the first week of February. The letter, which survived, was in a hand and a tone he had never had from her before. She told him, in short, sober sentences, that she had come to see that what had been between them could not be. She told him that she had accepted the addresses of another gentleman, whom her family approved, and that she meant to marry him. She asked Émile to return to her every letter she had ever sent him, and to consider himself, from that day forward, free of every promise she had ever made him. She wished him well in his life. She signed the letter with her formal name, Madeleine H. Smith. Émile Langelier read that letter on a February evening at Franklin Place, sitting by his coal fire. He read it a second time. He put it into the black tin box on the top of the cupboard, and he locked the box. He did not return her letters. He did not, that night, answer at all. He sat, according to his landlady, for a long time in his chair by the fire without moving, and when he at last got up, he went to the little table where he kept his writing things, and drew a sheet of paper toward him and dipped his pen. What he wrote in reply we do not have, because Madeleine, when it came, burned it. What we know of its substance we know only from her answering letters, and from what he said to Miss Perry in her parlour on a Sunday afternoon at the end of that same month. He had told Madeleine, in that first reply and in the letters that followed it through February and into March, that the letters she had written to him over 2 years and more were still in his possession, in a black tin box in the front room at Franklin Place, and that if she persisted in her present course, he would place them, unopened by any other hand, into the hand of her father. Madeleine, in her basement room at Blythswood Square, read those letters by the light of the same gas lamp on the far wall. She read them once. She read them again. She folded them and put them into the drawer under the shawl. She sat, for a long time, with her hands in her lap and the coals in the little grate burning down to their red stage. Somewhere above her, the household was going up to bed. Somewhere across the city, in the shop of a chemist on Sauchiehall Street whose name was Curry, an assistant was closing the shutters over the window and turning the key in the door, and the poison book was sitting on its shelf behind the counter with a fresh page ready in it, and the name of Miss Madeleine Smith of No. 7 Blythswood Square had not yet been written on that page in any hand at all. The chemist's ledger. Come with me now onto a pavement in Sauchiehall Street on a raw morning in the 3rd week of February of 1857. There is no rain on the stones today. There is instead a fine white frost that has held from before dawn and has not yet let go, and the breath of every person who passes stands out in front of them in the cold air as they walk. The gutters are ridged with ice at the edges where the water froze in the night, and a boy with a broom is pushing a black slush of coal grit and horse dung down toward the drain at the corner of Wellington Street. A milk cart is drawn up outside a grocer's, and the horse in the shafts is shifting its weight from one hoof to the other, because the iron has begun to bite up through the frog. The shops have their windows lit against the greyness of the morning. Halfway along the north side of the street, between a draper's and a stationer's, there is a shop with a curved bow window and gilt letters above the door that spell out the name of Murdoch, chemist and druggist. It is toward that shop that a young woman in a dark cloak and a plain bonnet is walking, at a steady pace, with her hands inside a muff, and her eyes fixed on a point on the pavement 6 feet in front of her feet. She had come out of the house at Blythswood Square a little after 10. Her mother had thought her gone to a lecture at a hall in Bath Street on the antiquities of the East. Her sister had thought her gone to fetch a length of ribbon from a shop she had promised to look at. The maid who had let her out of the front door had thought nothing at all, because it was not the business of a housemaid in that year to think about the errands of the young mistress of the house. She had crossed the square. She had gone up West George Street and had cut across Bath Street to Sauchiehall Street, and she had walked the length of 2 blocks without meeting anyone whose eye she had to catch, and she had come now to the door of Murdoch's shop with the bell above it, and had put out her gloved hand and had pushed the door open, and the bell had rung once above her head as she went in. The shop, when she stepped into it, was as most chemists' shops of that year were. There was a long counter of dark polished wood running the length of it. Behind the counter there was a wall of small drawers with hand-lettered labels on brass plates, and above the drawers there were glass-fronted cabinets with rows of stoppered jars in blue and green and clear glass, each with a printed paper label pasted around the neck. On the counter itself there were brass scales with a set of graduated weights beside them, and a marble slab for the making up of pills, and a spatula, and a bottle of gum arabic solution with a brush laid across the mouth. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of camphor and beeswax and rosewater, and something faintly sharp underneath, which was the smell of the acids kept in the back room. A gas jet burned above the counter in a glass shade. Behind the counter stood the assistant, a young man of perhaps 23, in a black apron over a white shirt, who looked up as the bell rang and set down the pestle he had been using in a mortar and came forward. She had rehearsed, on the pavement outside, the exact form of the words she meant to say. She did not want the assistant to be able to tell, afterwards, that she had come in nervous. She wanted the request to sound ordinary, the way a request for tooth powder or for a jar of cold cream would sound ordinary, and she wanted to be out of the shop again inside 3 minutes. She smiled at the young man across the counter, in the way she had smiled at 50 grocers and drapers and stationers in her life, and she said that she wished for a small quantity of arsenic. She said it in the same tone she would have used for 1/4 pound of coffee. She added, as though she had only just remembered, that they were greatly troubled at present with rats in the cellar of the house, and that she had promised her mother she would call in and buy the arsenic herself, because the cook was out and the maid could not be spared. The assistant did not, in that moment, hesitate. He was not a fool. He had heard the request 100 times from 100 housekeepers and mistresses of houses in Sauchiehall Street and its neighbouring streets. What the request required of him, by the law then in force, was not refusal but paperwork. The Sale of Arsenic Act of 1851 had been in operation for 6 years. Under that act, a chemist could not sell arsenic to a stranger. He could sell it to a person he knew, or to a person known to a witness present at the sale. He was required to enter the sale into a bound book kept for the purpose, with the date, the name and address of the buyer, the quantity sold, and the reason given. The buyer was required to sign the entry. And the arsenic itself, unless expressly wanted for a use in which colouring would spoil the purpose, had to be mixed with soot or with indigo to make it plainly distinguishable from flour or sugar or salt. All of this was on the printed sheet that hung beside the counter, in the way that a coaching timetable used to hang in the parlour of an inn, so that any customer who cared to look could see the terms on which the shop did its trade. Murdoch himself, the master of the shop, came out from the back room in his apron while the assistant was still weighing out the powder. He knew Miss Smith by sight. She had been in the shop with her mother a year or more before, for a bottle of eau de cologne, and he had, on that visit, been introduced to her by name. That, under the Act, was enough. She was, in the language of the law, known to the seller. He greeted her civilly. He asked after Mrs. Smith. He watched, without appearing to watch, while his assistant tipped the arsenic from the horn scoop into a small paper twist and folded the paper down at the ends, and he watched while the boy took a second, smaller twist and put into it a pinch of soot from a covered pot on the shelf and folded that in with the first. The finished packet was black-flecked and unmistakable. It was tied about with a length of string and set on the counter in front of her. The poison book was brought up from beneath the counter and opened at the current page. A pen was dipped. The particulars were written in the assistant's steady, clerical hand. She was asked to sign at the end of the line. She signed. Madeleine H. Smith, in her own upright, careful writing, on a ruled line in a bound book of a chemist's shop in Sauchiehall Street on the 21st of February 1857. She paid the sixpence. She took the packet. She put it into the muff. She thanked the master, and she thanked the boy, and she went out of the shop with the bell ringing again above her as the door closed behind her, and she turned to her right in the direction of Buchanan Street, and she walked as steadily as she had walked coming. I want to stop on that pavement for a moment. I want you to notice something that is easy to miss when a story like this one is told at speed. There is nothing in what she had just done that was hidden. There is no secret about it in any true sense. Her name was in a book, in ink, in a shop that stood on the main shopping street of her city. Her address was in the book next to her name. Her reason was in the book next to her address. Anyone who came into that shop and asked to see the poison book, a policeman, a doctor, a coroner, a father, could have opened the book and read her name at the head of the entry, in her own hand. She had signed for enough arsenic, in that first sale, to have killed 40 or 50 grown men. And she had done it in the plain light of a February morning, 3 streets from her father's front door, and had walked home in the same cloak she had gone out in, and had come in through her own hall, and had gone up to her room, and had put the packet away, and had come down to luncheon, and had spoken with her mother about the goodness of the mutton. The record does not tell us what she did with the packet in the days that followed. It does not tell us whether she opened it that first evening or left it in a drawer for a fortnight. It does not tell us whether she used any of the powder for the reason she had given the shop. There is a note, weeks later, in a letter of her mother's to a cousin, that speaks of the cellar of the house at Blythswood Square as being much troubled with vermin that winter, and of the cook having complained of finding droppings in the flour bin. Whether that note is honest domestic complaint, or whether it is the truth that Madeleine had banked on in advance when she chose her reason at the counter, I cannot with any confidence tell you. The two possibilities sit side by side in the record, and I do not think we will ever know which of them is the real one. Come with me forward, then, to a morning in the first week of March, in a shop of a different chemist, half a mile from Murdoch's, on the corner of Sauchiehall Street and Renfield Street. The shop is that of Curry, druggist and dispenser, and it is a rather grander establishment than Murdoch's, with a mahogany-fronted counter and a young apprentice in a green apron sweeping the doorstep as she comes up. She goes in. She asks again for arsenic. She gives, this time, a different reason. She has been reading, she tells the assistant, in a periodical, that a preparation of arsenic much diluted, applied as a wash, is thought by ladies on the continent to be of benefit to the complexion. She is willing to try it. She would like 6 pennyworth. The assistant, who knows her father by reputation and knows the house at Blythswood Square by sight, brings out the poison book, dips the pen, and asks her to sign. She signs. Madeleine H. Smith, on the 6th of March 1857, arsenic, for cosmetic use. The powder, again, is mixed with soot. The packet is tied with string. She pays. She thanks. She goes. She came back to Curry's for a third packet, 12 days later, on the 18th of March. That third visit is the one at which, if there was any moment when the whole quiet plan of the winter might have broken open in front of her, there was a moment. The assistant, on that occasion, hesitated. He had noticed, in the entries of the book, that this was her second visit within the fortnight. He looked at her, over the counter, longer than he had looked at her the first time. He asked whether the cosmetic wash had been of use. She said calmly that it had been of some use, but that she wished to try the preparation again in a slightly different strength. He glanced toward the back room, where Curry himself was compounding a linctus for a customer. He set out the powder. He tipped it into the paper. He asked her to sign. And she signed. Madeleine H. Smith, on the 18th of March, 1857, arsenic, for cosmetic use, second application. Between those 3 visits to those 2 shops, A very great number of things had been going on in her life that had nothing at all to do with any chemist's counter. Her engagement to William Minnock had been settled and had begun, in a discreet way, to be spoken of by mutual friends. A date late in the summer had begun to be considered. A dressmaker had been consulted. Her father had spoken to his own man of business about the settlement he meant to make on his eldest daughter. Her mother had begun to sort, at odd hours, through the linen of the house, deciding which pieces should go with Madeleine to India Street and which should remain at Blythswood Square. Bessie had begun to speak, half in jest and half in earnest, of what her sister's drawing-room would look like once it was hers, and of the dinners she would give in it, and of who she would invite. Émile Langelier, at Franklin Place, had gone on writing his letters. He had not, in any of them, softened. He had told her, again, that the letters were in the black tin box. He had told her, again, that if she persisted, he would place the box in her father's hand. He had, in one letter of that same month of March, threatened to place them not with her father, but with William Minnock, in the counting-room at Holdsworth's, so that the man she meant to marry could read for himself, in her own handwriting, what she had been to another man for 2 years. He had been ill, off and on, through the winter. He had come in more than once to his lodgings in Franklin Place, complaining of pains in his stomach, and had spent the following day in his bed, and the landlady, Mrs. Jenkins, had brought him beef tea, and had thought, without much alarm, that the young Frenchman had a delicate stomach, and did not eat as regularly as a young man should. Nobody, on either side of the city, put those small nights of sickness together with anything at all. Let me leave her, for the moment, at the top of the front steps at number 7, on an evening late in March. It is a Sunday. The bells of the churches in the square have not long stopped ringing. Her mother and her sister have gone into the drawing-room to receive a call from an aunt, and her father is in his study with the newspaper. Madeleine has come in from a walk. She has taken off her cloak in the hall and has given it to the maid, and she has gone down the passage past the study door and has turned to the stair that leads down to the basement. She is going to her own room. Her muff is in her hand. Inside the muff, folded into a linen handkerchief, is what is left of the 3rd packet from Curry's shop. She is going, quite calmly, down the stair. Somewhere across the west of the city, in his front room at Franklin Place, Pierre-Émile Langelier is putting on his good boots and his low, dark coat, and he is telling his landlady that he means to take a walk that evening as far as Blythswood Square, and that he will not, he thinks, be back much before 1. The death in Franklin Place. Come with me across the west end of the city, on that same March evening, to a lodging-house in Franklin Place. The street runs quietly off Great Western Road, and the houses along it are of good grey stone, set back a little from the pavement, with iron railings and short flights of steps up to their doors. Number 11 is one of the plainer of them. Mrs. Jenkins keeps it. She has 3 lodgers at present. The front room on the 1st floor is taken by a young Frenchman, a warehouse clerk of quiet habits, who has been under her roof rising 2 years. His name, in her rent book, is Mr. Langelier. She likes him. She has said so often to her sister in Rutherglen. He pays on the day. He is civil to the girl who does the stair. He asks for very little that is not on the tray. On the Sunday evening of the 22nd of March, 1857, at a little after 9, he came down her stair in his low, dark coat and his good boots, and he stopped at her parlour door to say that he was going out. She was sitting by her fire with her mending on her lap. She looked up. She asked him whether he would be back for supper. He smiled at her and said no, that he would be very late and that she was not to sit up. He added, in the mild way he had, when he wished to reassure her, that he was going only as far as a friend's house, and that he had eaten already, and that she was to lock the door at her usual hour and to go to her bed. He touched the brim of his hat. He went out. The front door of number 11 closed behind him with its familiar dull sound, and Mrs. Jenkins in the parlour took up her mending again and thought no more about it. He walked eastward along Great Western Road in the direction of the town. It is not a short walk from Franklin Place to Blythswood Square. It is close on a mile, and on a March evening, with the wind coming off the river and a fine cold rain beginning to fall on the paving, it is a walk that a man in a thin coat feels in his chest before he is halfway. The record of his movements that night is thinner than we would wish. He was seen, we know, by a man of his acquaintance on Sauchiehall Street a little before 10. He was seen again by a policeman on his beat at the corner of West George Street some minutes after. Between there and the basement window at number 7 Blythswood Square, there is a small gap in what we can prove, and I am not going to fill it in with anything I do not have. What we do have is the memory, later, of the servant who slept at the top of the house at number 7, that she heard, at about 10:30 that night, the sound of the lower area gate being unlatched, and the sound of a step going down the iron stair into the sunken area, and, some little while after, the sound of a step coming up. What we have, from Madeleine herself, said years later, in a letter, and never contradicted, is that she went, on that night, to the front basement room, and that she stood at the tall barred window in the dark. What passed between her and the man on the other side of the bars, if he came, if she gave him anything, if he drank, I honestly cannot tell you. She said different things at different times, and none of what she said can now be tested against him, because he had by the following night no voice at all. He walked back. That much we know. He walked back the mile to Franklin Place, in the wind and the rain, with a cold already settling in him, and he came up the front steps of number 11 at somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, and let himself in with his own key, and went, without waking the house, up the stair to his own room. He unlaced his boots. He set them by the fireplace. He put his coat over the back of the chair. He got into his bed. Mrs. Jenkins, sleeping 2 floors below him, heard nothing at all. He woke, according to what he was later able to say, at about 5 o'clock, in a pain he could not at first place. It was low down, in the pit of the stomach, and it came in a hard closing grip, and let go, and came again. He got out of the bed. He felt for the candle on the little table. He struck a match. In the small yellow light he saw his own hand shaking. He got as far as the washstand before the sickness took him, and then he was on his knees on the boards, and there was no dignity left in him at all, and it went on until there was nothing left in him to bring up, and after that it went on some more. He got, in the end, to the bell pull by the head of the bed. He pulled it. The wire ran down through the walls of the house to a bell hung in the passage outside Mrs. Jenkins' kitchen, and the bell rang, in the still small hours of a Monday morning, over her sleeping head. She heard it in her dream first, and then in her waking, and she got out of her bed and put on her wrapper and lit her own candle and came up the stair. She found him, when she opened his door, sitting on the floor by the washstand with his back against the wall. He was very white. His nightshirt was undone at the neck. His hair was wet with sweat and stuck to his forehead. He was holding his stomach with both his hands. He looked up at her when the candle came round the door, and he said to her, in a voice she said afterwards she had never heard from him before, that he was very ill, and would she please, for the love of God, send for a doctor. She went. She woke the boy who slept in the kitchen and sent him running to the house of Dr. Stephen in the next street, and she came back up to her lodger and got him, with the help of the boy when he returned, off the boards and back onto his bed. She got water into him, and he could not keep it. She wiped his face with a cloth wrung out cold. She sat on the edge of the bed. Dr. Stephen, when he came in a nightshirt and a hastily buttoned coat, and he did what a Glasgow doctor of that year could do for a young man taken with a violent sickness of the stomach at 6 in the morning. He gave him a draught. He put a hot cloth on his belly. He said, to Mrs. Jenkins on the stair afterwards, that he had seen many such attacks in young men who ate carelessly at coffee-houses on a Sunday, and that the young Frenchman was to be kept warm, and given weak brandy and water when he could take it, and that if the pain did not go off by the middle of the day, he was to be sent for again. Émile lay through the morning. The pain went off a little toward noon. He slept an hour or two in broken pieces. Mrs. Jenkins sat with him some of the time and left him to sleep the rest. He took a spoon or two of the brandy and water in the afternoon. He was, by the evening, weak but easier, and he said to her, when she came in with a light, that he thought the worst of it was over. She was very glad. She left him with the candle burning low on the little table and went down to see to her own supper. He rose from that bed the following day. That is the thing that is easy to forget in the telling of this story. He did not die from the sickness of that first night. He got up. He dressed himself. He went, on the Tuesday, to his desk at the warehouse of Huggins in St. Vincent Place, and he stayed there for the greater part of the afternoon. He came home on his own feet. He ate a little supper in his room. He wrote, that evening, a short note to his friend Mr. Kennedy at the warehouse, saying that he had been unwell but was much recovered, and asking whether they might dine together on the coming Thursday. He posted the note himself the following morning in the box at the corner of the street. He was, by every appearance, on the mend. I want to slow, here, for a moment, because what happens in the days that follow is the hardest part of the record to read straight, and I do not want you to lose the shape of it. The whole of that week, from the Monday of his first sickness through to the Sunday that came after, is a week in which a young man walked to and from his work in the ordinary way, sat in the ordinary manner at his desk, ate ordinary meals in ordinary rooms, and, at intervals, was taken with the same closing pain in his stomach, and was very ill in his bed, and got up, and went back to his work, and was ill again. There was, over that week, no single moment of alarm. There were only these small nights of sickness, coming and going, that Mrs. Jenkins put down to a delicate constitution, and that Dr. Stephen, called in twice more, put down to a chill on the stomach. On the Sunday evening, the 22nd night after the first attack, he was again out of the house. He had gone, according to what he told Mrs. Jenkins, for a walk in the air, and he had gone, according to a letter found afterwards in his pocket-book, to the corner of Blythswood Square once more. Whether he stood at the basement window in the sunken area that Sunday, whether the tall bars parted him again from the girl within, whether a cup came through them into his cold hands, I cannot with any real certainty tell you. The evidence at the trial was fought over on that point until the jury was nearly buried under it, and no one, then or now, has ever been able to settle it beyond argument. What is certain is that he came home from that walk. What is certain is that he was, before dawn, again on the boards by his bed, in a worse pain than any that had come before. Mrs. Jenkins, when she got up to him this time, took one look at his face in the candle-light, and sent the boy without a word for the doctor. Dr. Stephen came again. This time he did not speak of coffee-houses. He did what he could, which was very little. Émile was taken with a violent purging that no medicine of that year could hold. He was cold to the touch. His pulse was thin under the doctor's fingers. His skin, on the back of his hand, had begun to have the dry, loose look of a man very much drained. He asked once for water and could not keep it. He asked once for a priest, though he was not, so far as Mrs. Jenkins knew, a Catholic. She sent the boy for a minister of the Scots Kirk instead, because that was the church of her own street. The minister, when he came, sat by the bed and read aloud a psalm from the small book he had brought with him, and Émile lay with his eyes half open, and did not, so far as the minister could tell, follow the words. He died, in the room over Franklin Place, at 11 o'clock in the morning of the Monday, the 23rd of March, 1857. He was 29 years old. The doctor closed his eyes. The minister put on his hat. Mrs. Jenkins, in the passage outside the door, put her apron up to her face and wept for a long time, and then she went down to her kitchen and boiled a kettle, because there were arrangements to be made, and the making of tea is what a woman of that street did when there was something ahead of her she could not yet face. The doctors of that year did not, at the moment of that death, know what had killed him. Dr. Stephen was uneasy. He had never quite been happy about the pattern of the sickness through the week before, and he did not now believe it was the ordinary chill on the stomach he had first named. He asked, at the door of the bedroom, of the friend of the dead man who had come round from the warehouse, whether there was any objection to a post-mortem examination of the body. The friend, a Mr. Stevenson, said that so far as he knew, there was no family in Scotland to object, and that he for his part would wish it. And so, on the following morning, in the small parlour at Franklin Place, with the shutters closed against the street, 2 doctors of the city opened the body of Pierre-Émile Langelier and took out his stomach and preserved it in a jar. They sent the jar, in a wooden box, to Dr. Frederick Penny at Anderson's College on George Street, whose particular study was the detection of poisons. Dr. Penny received the box on the Tuesday. He was, at that time, one of the 2 or 3 men in Scotland best fitted to do the work that was now put in front of him. He worked at it in his laboratory over the college for the better part of a week. He used what was then called the Reinsch test and the Marsh test after it, and 1 or 2 others of his own devising. He wrote his findings, in a small, careful hand, into a bound notebook that later passed into the possession of the Crown. In the stomach of Pierre-Émile Langelier, he wrote, he had found arsenic. Not a trace. Not a small quantity. Something over 80 grains. Enough, he wrote, to have killed several men. The word of that finding, when it left the laboratory over Anderson's College, went first to the Procurator Fiscal, and from the Procurator Fiscal to the Sheriff, and from the Sheriff to a small quiet room in the criminal office in Glasgow, where a policeman by the name of Mr. Murray sat down with a pen and drew, at the head of a fresh sheet of paper, the beginnings of the case that would open, 11 weeks later, in the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. He wrote, at the top of that sheet, the name of the dead man. He wrote, at the top of the sheet beside it, another name, in the same steady hand. Madeleine H. Smith, of No. 7 Blythswood Square, in the city of Glasgow, spinster, aged 22 years. Not proven. I'll write chapter 10 now, the final chapter, closing the production the way the master prompt requires. Come with me across the city one last time, on a Tuesday afternoon at the end of March 1857, to the front hall of a house on India Street, in the West End of Glasgow. The house belongs to a merchant named William Minnock. The girl who has been meaning to marry him has come to spend an afternoon under his mother's roof, in the ordinary courtesy expected of an engaged woman, and she has been in that hall no more than a quarter of an hour, when the maid comes in to say that a gentleman is at the door and wishes to speak with her on a private matter. The gentleman is a policeman in plain clothes. He is very civil. He asks Miss Smith whether she would consent to come with him, in a hansom, to the office of the sheriff. She looks at him. She does not, so far as the maid could afterwards say, alter in her face at all. She fetches her cloak. She goes. She was taken that afternoon, without being told in so many words that she was under any charge, into a room on the upper floor of the criminal office in Glasgow, and there she sat opposite the Procurator Fiscal for the greater part of 2 hours, and answered the questions he put to her in the manner of a young woman who had never in her life heard the name of Pierre-Émile Langelier. She had known such a person, she said, only slightly. She had met him once or twice in company. She had exchanged, perhaps, a note or two, of the ordinary kind that pass between acquaintances. She was very sorry to hear that he was dead. She had bought arsenic, yes, on the dates that were named to her, at the shops that were named to her, for the uses she had given at the counter. She had put a little of it on her face and neck, mixed with cold water, in the manner she had read of. She had thrown the rest away. She had not at any time given any of it to any person, and she had certainly not given any of it to the young Frenchman who was now, she was being told, lying under a coroner's seal in a room across the town. She signed the declaration she was given to sign. She was allowed to go home. She was arrested in her own bedroom at number 7 Blythswood Square before 8 o'clock the following morning and taken to the county jail at Duke Street in a covered carriage and lodged there in a cell to await her trial. Her father, when the officers came for her, did not, so far as any account we have says, come out of his study. Her mother took to her bed. Bessie, the sister who had slept beside her for the whole of their girlhood, was allowed, once, to visit her at the gaol, and came away from that visit and did not speak of it, then or afterwards, to any person who ever wrote of it. The trial opened in the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, in the Parliament House at the head of the High Street, on the morning of Tuesday the 30th of June 1857, and it did not close until the 9th day after. Every bench in the court was full. Every gallery was full. The pavement outside the great door on Parliament Square was thick with people in the early morning hours, waiting to be let in, and the ushers had to push a passage through them for the counsel in their gowns. The presiding judge was John Hope, the Lord Justice Clerk, a stern man of the old school, who sat under the royal arms in a wig that hung to his shoulders, and a face that gave nothing away for the whole of the 9 days. The counsel for the Crown was James Moncrieff, the Lord Advocate. The counsel for the defence was John Inglis, the Dean of Faculty, then at the height of his powers, and reckoned by every man of law in Scotland the finest advocate of his generation. Between the two of them, over the 9 days that followed, the whole life of Pierre-Émile Langelier and the whole life of the young woman in the dock was taken out and laid on the table in front of the 15 men of the jury, piece by piece, in the strong grey light that came in through the high windows of that old room. She was brought up from the cell below the court each morning by a warder, and sat through each day in the wooden dock at the side of the room, in a plain dark dress and a straw bonnet with a black ribbon at the throat, and a veil that she pushed back only when the judge required her to hear a piece of evidence in full. She did not, in the whole of those 9 days, so much as weep in public. She was seen, once or twice, to lean forward to hear a particular witness a little better. She was seen, once, to write a note on a slip of paper and pass it down to her solicitor. She was not seen to break. Every newspaper in the country remarked upon it. Some of them called it composure. Some of them called it strength. Some of them, in language that would not now be printed, called it something worse. What it looked like from inside the head of the young woman under the bonnet, I honestly cannot tell you, and I do not think any person then in that court could have told you either. The evidence for the Crown was, on the face of it, very heavy indeed. The chemists were brought. Their books were brought. The entries in her own upright hand were read aloud in the court, and the packets of soot-flecked arsenic were produced from a green baize bag on the clerk's table and set out in a row for the jury to see. The doctors were brought. Dr. Penny gave his findings on the stomach in a voice so quiet that the Lord Justice Clerk more than once asked him to repeat a sentence. Mrs. Jenkins was brought from Franklin Place and told in the plain speech of a landlady the story of the 3 nights of sickness and the morning of the death. And then, on the 4th day, the letters were brought. Émile had kept every one. Some 300 of them tied about with tape in the black tin box he had once threatened to place before her father. The Lord Advocate had them read aloud, from the box, hour after hour, through the 4th and 5th days of the trial, and the court sat in a silence you could have heard a pin drop into, and the young woman in the dock, according to every reporter who watched her, sat with her hands folded and her chin up, and did not once lower her eyes. There is a thing about those letters that has to be said, because it is easily lost in the mere fact of their reading. They were not, in the main, letters about arsenic. They were love letters. They were the 2-year record of a young woman's inner life in the years between 20 and 22, written to the one person on earth she had believed she could tell it to, and they were now being spoken aloud, in Edinburgh, by a stranger in a wig, to a room of 1,000 men, and printed the following morning in every newspaper in the 3 kingdoms. What was on trial in that court, quite as much as any question of whether she had put arsenic into a cup of cocoa, was the fact that a young woman of a respectable Glasgow house had, in secret, the inner life of a woman who felt things and wrote them down. The verdict, when it came, would be shaped as much by that fact as by any bottle from Dr. Penny's laboratory. John Inglis rose for the defence on the 8th day. He spoke for 4 hours. It is a speech that men who study these things still read and still learn from, because it is one of the great speeches of the Scottish Bar. He did not, in it, ask the jury to believe that his client was a woman of no fault. He did not pretend to them that the letters were anything other than what they were. He asked them, instead, one plain question, and asked it in a great many careful shapes over the course of the afternoon. Where, on any night that had been named in the evidence, could the Crown place Pierre-Émile Langelier in the same room as his client, with a cup or a glass in his hand that she had given him? Not near the house. Not in the sunken area. Not at the tall barred window. In the same room, with the cup at his lips. The Crown could not do it. The Crown had not brought one witness who had seen it. The whole of the Crown's case was built upon a chain of things that might have happened, on nights that could not now be reconstructed, on the basis of the movements of a dead man who could no longer be asked. Between might and did, said John Inglis to the 15 men in front of him, there is the whole space in which a jury of Scotsmen has been asked, for 400 years, to weigh a human life. He sat down. The court rose. The jury went out at about 1:30 on the afternoon of the 9th day, the 9th of July, 1857, and they were out for 25 minutes, and then they came back into the court, and the foreman stood up in his place, and the Lord Justice Clerk asked him for their verdicts on the 3 charges upon which the panel had been tried. On the charge of the attempted murder in the February of that year, the foreman said, the verdict was not proven. On the charge of the attempted murder in the March of that year, the verdict was not proven. On the charge of the murder itself, on the 23rd of March, the verdict was, again, not proven. There is no third verdict of that name in the criminal law of any other country in the English-speaking world. It exists only in Scotland. It is not an acquittal, and it is not a conviction. It means, when it is honestly meant, that the jury believe the panel probably did the thing charged, but that the Crown has not proved it beyond the doubt the law requires. It is a verdict of the ear as much as of the mind. It is a verdict that lets a person walk out of the court and follows them for the rest of their life. Madeleine Smith walked out of the court that afternoon. There was a great shout in the room when the verdicts were read. Her uncle came forward to the dock. She was taken down the back stair and through a side passage and out into a carriage in a narrow close and driven away from Parliament House by a route that was kept from the crowd in the square, and she did not, from that afternoon to the last day of her long life, ever again set foot in the city of Edinburgh, or, so far as the record shows, in the city of Glasgow either. Come away with me now from the noise of that court, into the quiet years afterwards. She went, first, to relatives in the country. She stayed there for some months. The engagement to William Minnock was, of course, over, and Mr. Minnock himself, who had sat through the trial in a corner of the gallery, and had never once been called to speak, went back to his work at Holdsworth's, and did not marry anyone at all for many years. Her father, at Blythswood Square, kept his hours and his practice, and did not speak, ever, of the daughter whose name had run in the papers of the summer of that year. He died some years later, and left her nothing. She went, in the end, to London. She lived for a while in Bloomsbury, and then in Chelsea, under her own name, and moved in a set of young artists and craftsmen who cared very little for what she was said to have done in a basement room in Glasgow in her girlhood. In 1861, at the age of 26, she married a man named George Wardle, who worked as a designer for William Morris, and she was for many years a hostess in his house on Great Ormond Street, and knew, in that quiet late Victorian way, most of the artists and writers and socialists of that London circle. She had 2 children. She kept, so far as any friend of her later years ever said, no picture of Émile Langelier, and no letter of his, and no cutting of any newspaper from the summer of the trial. She spoke of Glasgow, when she spoke of it at all, as a place she had once been young in. Her marriage did not, in the end, hold. She left Wardle. She went, in her 60s, across the ocean to America, and settled at last in New York, where she lived in a boarding house in the Bronx under the name of Lena Sheehy, having married a second time, quietly, a man named William Sheehy. She died there, in a boarding house room, on the 12th of April 1928. She was 92 years old. She was buried in a small plot in Mount Hope Cemetery, at Hastings-on-Hudson, under a stone that gave her married name and the years of her birth and death, and nothing more. The stone is still there. I have not stood at it. Others have. They say it is easy to walk past. That is the end of the story, so far as the record can tell it. Whether the girl at the basement window of number 7 Blythswood Square, in the wet spring of 1857, put arsenic into the cocoa she passed through the bars to the young man in the damp overcoat, is a question that the 15 men of that Edinburgh jury did not feel they could answer with the certainty the law required, and it is a question that no person since, in 170 years, has been able to answer any better. The letters remain. The chemist's books remain. The stomach in the jar was long ago buried with the rest of him, in the little cemetery of the Ramshorn Kirk in Glasgow. The house at Blythswood Square is still there. The basement window is still there. The bars, when I last saw a picture of them, were still in place. The rain that came off the Clyde that April night has long since fallen and dried and fallen again. The candles in the drawing rooms of Blythswood Square have been out for 150 years. The girl in the nightdress at the window and the young man in the damp overcoat in the sunken area are gone into the ground on 2 different continents, and the truth of what passed between them in the last winter of her freedom has gone with them. The night is very late now. The wind has dropped. The hour has come round to the one that belongs to sleep. Somewhere a clock is striking, in a house you cannot see, in a street you have never walked. Let it go. Let the letters lie in their box. Let the stone in Hastings-on-Hudson keep its own quiet. The candle has burned low. The chamber has fallen silent. And history, once again, has turned the page in the dark.